Hey guys, tonight we are traveling back in time, and you'll be honest, our destination is not a 5-star resort. We're heading to a small, God-fearing town in 16th or 17th century Europe, right as the shadows are getting a little longer. And a quick heads up, in the world we are about to enter, blending in is your only survival skill. Being too smart, too old, too poor, or as we'll soon discover, too beautiful, could get you a one-way ticket to a very public and very unpleasant barbecue. You'd probably not make it through the first day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The last sliver of the sun is bleeding out behind the jagged line of the forest, painting the underside of the clouds in shades of bruised purple and angry orange. You pull your shawl a little tighter around your shoulders. The air is damp, carrying the familiar, earthy scent of wood smoke, wet soil, and something else, something metallic and sharp. It's the smell of fear, a scent you've grown so accustomed to. You barely even notice it anymore. Your wooden shoes clatter softly on the uneven cobblestones of the main lane, a sound that seems too loud in the growing quiet of the evening. To your left and right, the timber-framed houses lean in towards each other, their upper floors jetting out over the street, almost close enough to touch. They look like old gossips, whispering secrets into the narrow space between them. The windows are small, dark eyes, and one by one, heavy wooden shutters are being latched from the inside, not just against the night chill, but against whatever the night might hold. This is your home. This small, tightly wound knot of a town, huddled in the shadow of a church spire that scrapes at the sky. Life here is a predictable rhythm, dictated by the rising sun, the tolling of the church bell, and the turning of the seasons. It's a life of hard work, careless turns, and simple faith. You believe in God, in the saints, and in the promise of heaven, but just as fervently, you believe in the devil. And lately, it feels like the devil is walking these very streets, his breath curling like frost on the window panes. You pass by the baker's house. A few months ago, his wife, Greta, would have been at her door, offering you a warm smile and perhaps a day-old roll. Now, the door is shut tight. The window's dark. You haven't seen her smile in weeks, ever since her youngest grew sick with a fever the apothecary couldn't break. A curtain of suspicion has fallen over their home. People don't meet her eyes at the market. They make the sign of the cross when she passes. No one has said the word, not out loud, but it hangs in the air, thick and suffocating, which, this is the new currency of your town: suspicion. A failed crop, a stillborn calf, a sudden illness, a strange dream. Nothing is just misfortune anymore. It's a sign, a symptom of a hidden rot, a malignant influence working its will in the dark. Historians still debate the precise cocktail of causes that fueled this era of intense paranoia. Some point to the Little Ice Age, a period of climatic cooling that led to widespread famine and desperation, making people desperate for a scapegoat. Others focus on the religious turmoil of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, which made everyone hyper-aware of heresy and demonic influence. The truth is likely a messy combination of it all. But for you, living inside of it, the academic reasons don't matter. What matters is the knot in your stomach as you walk home. As you reach your own small cottage at the edge of the town square, your hand instinctively goes to the heavy oak door. Just beside the iron latch, you trace a small daisy-wool pattern carved into the wood. It's a hex foil, a common apiotrope mark, a bit of folk magic to ward off evil. It's a funny little contradiction, isn't it, using a touch of what some might call witchcraft to protect yourself from, well, witchcraft. It's a quiet testament to how deeply the supernatural is woven into the fabric of your life, a belief so profound it's literally etched into the architecture of your home. Most houses have them strange geometric symbols scratched into fireplaces. Door frames and window sills are silent. Superstitious defense grid against the unseen world. You slip inside. The scent of dried herbs and stew from your own hearth a small comfort. You slide the heavy wooden bolt into place. The sound is final. A clear division between the relative safety of your home and the creeping dread of the world outside. But it doesn't feel like enough. You peek through a thin crack in the shutters. The town square is empty now, save for a stray dog sniffing at a pile of refuse. The twilight has deepened into a true, dark gloom. The shadows cast by the houses are long and distorted, seeming to writhe and twist in the periphery of your vision. It feels like the whole town is holding its breath, waiting for the first scream, the first accusation, the first flicker of a torch in the night. And you can't shake the feeling that it's coming soon. The night passes, as it always does, in a series of half-waking dreams and punctuated silence. The cry of a fox, the distant bark of a dog, the creak of your own house settling. You wake with the first grey light, the habit of a lifetime. The routine of the day is a comfort, a familiar set of movements to push back the unease of the night. You stir the embers in the hearth, add a few small logs, and hang the kettle. Later, with your water buckets in hand, you head to the town well. This is the true heart of the village. More so than the church or the market square. It's where news is exchanged. Reputations are built, and aren't, more often than not, destroyed. As you approach, you see a small group of women already gathered. Their heads close together like a flock of nervous hens. Their voices are a low, conspiratorial hum. You recognize Martha, whose tongue is as sharp as her sewing needle, and old Agnes, her face a road map of wrinkles and grievances. You don't mean to eavesdrop. Not really. But in a space this small, secrets are a shared commodity. The name that floats on the air is Elspeth. I saw her myself, Martha says. Her voice died with self-importance, near the old woods, just as the sun was setting, gathering goodness knows what. Her basket was full of it. Her butter sold for a penny more than mine at market last week. Another woman mutters, pulling viciously on the well rope. Every turn. Perfect. It's not natural. My last batch went sour before it even set. This is how it begins. Not with a thunderclap, but with a whisper. A drop of poison in the community well. You think of Elspeth. She is younger than you, married to the blacksmith, a man whose work is in high demand. She has hair the color of spun flax and eyes the color of a summer sky. She laughs easily, a sound that rings clear and bright, and men and women notice her. Her beauty is of a kind that doesn't just exist, it announces itself. And in a world that values conformity and fears in excess of anything, her loveliness is an excess, a disruption. This is the core of Maleficarum, a key concept in historical witchcraft beliefs. It wasn't just about pacts with the devil or flying on broomsticks. For most ordinary people, the fear of witchcraft was deeply practical. It was the belief that a witch could cause specific, tangible harm, usually to a neighbor. It was curdled milk, a lame horse, a sick child, a sudden storm that flattened your barley. The accusation wasn't she worshipped Satan, but rather, she soured my milk. The satanic pact was the explanation the theologians and inquisitors provided later. But the initial spark was almost always a local, personal misfortune that needed a target. Old Agnes nods sagely, her chin trembling slightly. My grandson. He woke up screaming 2 nights ago. Said he saw a black cat with green eyes staring at him from the window. The very next morning, Elspeth walked by the house. She smiled at the boy. Agnes leans in, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. And he's been coughing ever since. A chill that has nothing to do with the morning air prickles your skin. You've heard these stories 100 times. They are the folk tales and warnings passed down through generations. But they feel different now. Heavier, more dangerous. What was once fireside chatter is becoming evidence. You pull your bucket up, the cold water slushing over the rim. You try to keep your face neutral, to betray nothing. In this environment, even a look of sympathy for the accused could be interpreted as complicity. Silence is the safest armor. Here lies a debate that historians continue to wrestle with. What was the primary driver of these accusations? Was it genuine, deeply held superstitious belief? Did Martha truly believe Elspeth's herbs were for dark magic? Or was it something more cynical? Was she envious of Elspeth's youth and beauty? Was the other woman using the spectre of witchcraft to explain away her own inferior butter-making skills? Or to damage a competitor's reputation? The answer is almost certainly both, and that's what makes it so insidious. The system was weaponized by personal grudges, but it was powered by the engine of authentic fear. The accusers may have been consciously or unconsciously settling scores, but they were doing so within a system where everyone, including themselves, genuinely believed in the reality of a witch's curse. A lesser-known, but common, accusation of the time often involved the theft of natural vitality. Some believed witches could steal the milk from a neighbor's cow, magically transporting it into their own pails, or even steal the fruitfulness from a neighbor's marriage or field. It was just about causing harm. It was about the supernatural theft of good fortune. So when someone like Elspeth appeared to be thriving while others struggled, it wasn't seen as luck or skill. In this paranoid mindset, her success had to be coming from somewhere. She must have taken it from someone else. You turn to leave. Your bucket's heavy, your heart heavier. As you walk away, you risk a glance towards the blacksmith's forge at the other end of the lane. A plume of smoke rises from its chimney, a sign of honest work. But, in your mind, tainted by the whispers from the well, the smoke seems to curl into a more sinister shape. The sound of the hammer on the anvil, once a comforting rhythm of village life, now sounds like a countdown. The whispers have started, and you know, with a dreadful certainty, that they will only get louder. The day unfolds, but the whispers from the well have stained it. Every familiar sight now seems to hold a double meaning. The way the wind rustles the leaves sounds like a hushed accusation. The shadows in the alleyways seem to conceal watching eyes. You try to focus on your tasks, mending a worn shirt, weeding the small herb garden behind your cottage, but your thoughts keep drifting back to Elspeth. You remember seeing her just a few days ago, returning from the forest, her cheeks flushed from the walk, a few wildflowers tucked into the band of her apron. She smiled at you, a genuine, unburdened smile. At the time, you thought nothing of it. It was just Elspeth, a bright spot in a dreary world. Now, in the poisonous light of the morning's gossip, the memory twists, near the old woods, gathering goodness knows what. That simple, innocent image is now reframed, tainted. It's becoming a piece of evidence. This is where the insidious logic begins to take hold. The idea that beauty itself is not a gift from God, but a mark of the devil. Think about it from the perspective of a devout, fearful, and perhaps envious villager. In a life defined by hardship, toil, and the slow decay of the body, how can someone possess such effortless radiance? Where does it come from? God grants blessings. Yes, but those are meant to be spiritual. Such overt, physical perfection feels worldly, carnal, and therefore suspicious. It doesn't fit the narrative of humble suffering that you're taught is the righteous path. A woman who is exceptionally beautiful, especially one who seems untroubled by the daily grind, presents a theological problem. The devil, as you've been taught, is the master of illusion and temptation. His entire enterprise is based on seducing souls away from God with worldly pleasures. And what is more worldly, more tempting, more capable of stirring pride and lust in the hearts of men than profound beauty? It's a lure, a trap. Therefore, an exceptionally beautiful face is not a testament to God's artistry, it's a billboard for a demonic contract. The logic is twisted, but within the confines of this worldview, it's terrifyingly coherent. She didn't just happen to be beautiful, she must have traded something for it. Her soul. You pause your wading, looking at your own hands. The knuckles chapped, the nails rimmed with dirt. You think of Martha's scowl, of ignis-tired, resentful face. Their lives are etched onto their skin. Elspeth's smooth brow and clear eyes seem to mock that reality. It's an unspoken affront to the shared experience of suffering. One of the more obscure, yet telling, details from this period is the suspicion surrounding cosmetics, or even just personal hygiene. While the idea of medieval people being universally filthy is a bit of an exaggeration, an excessive concern for one's appearance could be seen as a sign of vanity. One of the 7 deadly sins. Simple herbal lotions to soften the skin. A touch of berry juice to redden the lips. Things that might be seen as harmless self-care today could be interpreted as unnatural artifice. The argument went if God intended you to have a weathered face, then to artificially smooth it was to defy God's will. It was an attempt to create an illusion, and delusion was the devil's domain. So, a woman who was naturally beautiful was already under suspicion, and a woman who used any means to enhance or preserve her looks was practically signing a confession. The historical debate here is subtle but important. Did inquisitors and witch hunters actively unconsciously create the beauty as evidence narrative? Or did they simply tap into a pre-existing, deeply ingrained folk misogyny and social envy? Giving it a theological framework, most scholars now lean towards the latter. The hunters didn't invent the poison of envy, they just refined it, bottled it, and gave it a holy label. They provided a system where personal resentments could be laundered into righteous legal action. The beautiful woman became a perfect target because she often already stood apart from the community, an object of both admiration and jealousy. The witch hunt just gave that jealousy a vocabulary and a deadly purpose. You look up from your garden as the church bell begins to toll for midday prayer. The sound rolls across the town, a summons to piety. But today, it sounds less like a call to God and more like an alarm. Day warning. You find yourself looking in the direction of the blacksmith's forge again. In your mind's eye, you see Elspeth, not as a woman, but as a symbol of everything that this fearful, anxious world cannot tolerate: a life that seems too easy, a fortune that seems too good, and a face that is too beautiful. The danger is no longer abstract. It has a name and a face, and you realize, with a sinking heart, that in this world, a beautiful face can be the most dangerous thing a woman can possess. It's not just a feature, it's a liability. It's a pre-existing condition for an accusation waiting to happen. The whispers were the kindling. Her beauty is the fuel. No, all it needs is a spark. The next day is Sunday, the Sabbath, a day of mandated rest and reflection. But there is no rest in the air, only a taut, watchful tension. You put on your best wool shawl, the one you save for church and feast days, and join the slow-moving river of people flowing towards the stone edifice that dominates the town. The church is the only building large enough to hold everyone. The one place where the entire community is forced into a single, shared space. You file in through the heavy oak doors. The air inside immediately cooler, smelling of old stone, melting beeswax, and the faint, sweet scent of incense. Light, fractured by the colored glass of the high windows, paints shifting patterns on the stone floor. It's meant to be a place of sanctuary, of peace, but today, it feels like a courtroom. You find a place on a rough-hewn wooden bench, the wood worn smooth by generations of worshippers. You scan the crowd. You see Martha, her face a mask of piety. You see Agnes, her lips moving in silent, fervent prayer. Then, you see Elspeth, she's sitting with her husband, the blacksmith, a few rows ahead of you. She is still and composed, her flaxen hair neatly braided and covered by a simple white coif, as is proper. But even in the dim, holy light of the church, her presence is undeniable. She is like a single, bright candle in a room of sputtering tallow lamps. She seems oblivious to the stairs, or perhaps she is just adept at ignoring them. Her husband, a broad-shouldered man with soot permanently etched into the lines of his hands, stares grimly ahead, his jaw tight. He knows. He must know what they are saying about his wife. The priest, Father Thomas, ascends the pulpit. He is an old man, His voice usually a ready, comforting drone. But lately, his sermons have taken on a new fire, a new urgency. He leans forward, his bony knuckles white as they grip the edge of the pulpit. The devil is not a distant fable. He begins, his voice cracking with fervor. He is not a story to frighten children. He is real, and he is here. He walks among you, disguised as your neighbor, your friend. He seeks to plant his seeds of corruption in the fertile soil of our very own community. His eyes sweep across the congregation, and you feel a collective shrinking. No one wants to meet his gaze. And how does he achieve his aims? The priest continues, his voice rising. He preys on the weak, on the vain. He finds a soul already rotted with pride and offers them a bargain. Serve me, he whispers, and I will grant you your worldly desires. I will make you comely in the eyes of men. I will make you desirable, so that you might lead others into the sin of lust. I will give you a face so fair it can bewitch the senses, a charm that can curdle the milk and sicken the child of a good, God-fearing woman. He doesn't say her name. He doesn't have to. Every head, almost imperceptibly, turns towards Elspeth, 100 pairs of eyes, all carrying the same toxic mixture of fear and accusation. You watch as a single tear escapes from under Elspeth's closed eyelid and traces a path down her cheek. Her husband's hand finds hers, his grip a small, desperate anchor in a hostile sea. This is a prime example of how the church, often unwittingly, became a key amplifier of the witch hunt. Theologians and demonologists of the period were engaged in a serious, intellectual effort to understand and define the nature of evil. They wrote extensively about the devil's methods, his hierarchies of demons, and the specific ways witches drew their power from him. A key theological point was the idea of the demonic pact, the belief that a witch had to formally renounce God and pledge allegiance to Satan to gain her powers. This transformed witchcraft from a simple folk crime malefic into the ultimate act of heresy. When this high-level theology filtered down into local parish sermons, it gave a divine justification to local anxieties. Father Thomas isn't just talking about bad luck anymore, he's talking about a cosmic war for souls being fought right here, in your town. Historians often debate the level of cynicism versus true belief among the clergy. Did Father Thomas deliberately target Elspeth to create a scapegoat and reassert his own moral authority, or was he, too, a man of his time, genuinely terrified and seeing the devil's work in every shadow? The consensus is that it was rarely a simple case of one or the other. Like the villagers, many priests were true believers who were also susceptible to the same social pressures and prejudices as their flock. They were part of the system, not just its architects. As a little tidbit from this era is the concept of the diabolical gaze. Some demonological texts suggested that a witch could cause harm simply by looking at a person or an animal. This was known as the fascinum or the evil eye. A beautiful woman, whose gaze was more likely to be met and held by others, was therefore at a higher risk of being accused of this. If you looked at her, and she looked back, and then your pig got sick, the connection, in a paranoid mind, was obvious. Her captivating eyes were not a gift, but a weapon. The sermon continues. A relentless tide of brimstone and damnation. Father Thomas speaks of vanity, of temptation, of the deceptive beauty of the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Each word is a stone cast at Elspeth. You are witnessing a trial before the trial, a conviction delivered from the pulpit. The church, meant to be a place of refuge, has been weaponized. It has focused the vague, scattered anxieties of the village into a single, sharp point. When the service finally ends, the congregation files out in near silence. The usual Sunday chatter is gone. As Elspeth and her husband walk down the aisle, the people part before them, creating a wide, empty space around the couple as if they are carrying a plague. No one meets their eyes. The isolation is now complete, made official, sanctified by the house of God. The whispers have been given a voice. The spark has been struck. A few days later, a new and terrible energy ripples through the town. Two men on horseback arrive. Their faces grim, their clothes dark and practical. One is a local magistrate, a man you recognize from the county seat. The other is a stranger, bolder, with eyes that seem to see right through you, weighing unjudging. He carries a heavy leather satchel, and the way he handles it suggests its contents are of grave importance. They dismount in the square, and a crowd begins to gather, drawn by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. The stranger is an inquisitor, or at least a lay expert in demonology, invited by the local authorities to assist, and in his satchel, is the tool that will transform the town's vague paranoia into a systematic, procedural nightmare. He will likely be carrying a copy of a book that, for the next 2 centuries, will become one of the most infamous and deadly texts ever printed. It's called the Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches. You won't read it, of course. You can't read, but you've heard of it. It's spoken of in hushed, terrified tones. It is the authority, the ultimate guide to identifying, prosecuting, and exterminating witches. It is, in essence, a handbook for horror. Let's take a moment and, metaphorically, flip through its pages. Published in 1487 by 2 German Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Springer, the Malleus Maleficarum was a sensation. It arrived just as the printing press was becoming more widespread, allowing its toxic ideas to spread like wildfire across Europe. For a long time, it was second only to the Bible in sales in some parts of the continent. The book is divided into 3 parts. The first part is all about proving, with dense theological arguments, that witchcraft is not only real but is one of the greatest threats to Christendom. It systematically refutes anyone who might be skeptical, essentially arguing that to not believe in witches is itself a form of heresy. It sets the trap, doubt me, and you're one of them. The second part is where it gets truly specific and fantastically grim. This section is a detailed catalogue of what witches supposedly do. It describes their pacts with the devil, their sabbaths, their ability to fly, to shape-shift, to cause impotence in men, to raise hailstorms, and to steal babies, and, crucially, it dedicates a huge amount of its text to the specific wickedness of women. The book is profoundly, almost obsessively, misogynistic. The very title, Malleus Maleficarum, uses the feminine form of the Latin word for witch or evildoer. The authors argue that women are more impressionable, more carnal, more vengeful, and therefore far more susceptible to the devil's temptations than men. They were seen as defective men, weaker in faith and intellect. Here, in the pages of this book, is where the case against beauty is made explicit. The Malleus argues that a witch's power often lies in her ability to create glamour, an illusion to bewitch and deceive men. An exceptionally beautiful woman is therefore a prime suspect. Is her beauty natural or is it a glamour? A demonic illusion woven to ensnare the souls of the righteous. The book provides the experts with the perfect, unfalsifiable accusation. If a woman is beautiful, she's using glamour. The proof of her witchcraft is her very fate. The third section is the most chilling. It is a step-by-step legal and procedural guide on how to prosecute a witch. It advises magistrates on how to handle witnesses, how to trick the accused into a confession, and, most importantly, it gives a full-throated endorsement of torture to extract the truth. It argues that since witchcraft is an exceptional crime, the normal rules of evidence and legal procedure do not apply. A witch is so cunning, so protected by the devil, that only extreme measures will break her silence. One of the more bizarre and specific pieces of legal advice in the Malleus is the instruction to shave all the hair from an accused witch's body before interrogation. The logic was that the devil might hide a charm or a magical sigil in their hair to help them resist pain and refuse to confess. This practice became a common and deeply humiliating partisan process, a physical stripping of identity and humanity before the torture even began. It was a ritual of degradation disguised as a procedural necessity. Now it's important for me to mention a point of ongoing scholarly debate. For a long time, the Malleus Maleficarum was seen as the single, authoritative manual that directly caused the great European witch hunts. However, modern historians have nuanced this view. Many now argue that while the book was influential, it was not universally adopted by all courts. Some legal authorities rejected it, and many trials proceeded along different legal tracks. The book was more of a symptom and decoded fear of existing misogyny and fear than the sole cause. It didn't start the fire, but it was an enormous bucket of gasoline thrown onto a smoldering pyre. It gave a veneer of intellectual and theological legitimacy to what was often mob justice and paranoid persecution. Back in your town square, the Inquisitor has begun to speak. His voice is calm, rational, and utterly terrifying. He doesn't shout like Father Thomas. He explains. He reasons. He talks about law, about procedure, about the necessity of rooting out the cancer in the community's midst. He speaks of the devil's wiles with the dry certainty of a scholar discussing a textbook. He is making the unthinkable seem reasonable. He is laying down the tracks for the train that is about to run through your town. And you know, as you watch him, that the whispers from the well and the sermon from the pulpit have now found their instrument. The vague fear has been given a rule book. The nightmare is about to become official. It happens 2 evenings later. The sun has just set, and the sky is the color of a fading bruise. Most people are inside. The doors bolted. The evening meal on the table, a fragile peace has settled, the kind that feels more like a held breath than genuine calm. Then, the sound, the heavy, rhythmic tramp of boots on the cobblestones, a sharp, authoritative knock on a door that echoes through the lane. You rush to your window, peeking through the crack in the shutters. Your heart is a frantic bird beating against your ribs. The knocking is at the blacksmith's forge. The 2 men who arrived a few days ago, the magistrate and the Inquisitor, are standing on the doorstep. They are flanked by 2 sturdy local men, deputized for the occasion, one of them holding a lit torch that throws wild, dancing shadows against the walls. The door opens. The blacksmith, his large frame filling the doorway, looks small and bewildered. You can't hear the words, but you can see the formal, unyielding posture of the magistrate as he speaks. The blacksmith shakes his head, his voice a low, desperate rumble. He tries to block the doorway, a protective instinct, but he's no match for the force of law and righteous certainty. One of the deputies shoves him aside, a rough, dismissive gesture that strips him of his authority in his own home. And then, they bring her out, Elspeth. Her hands are bound in front of her with a coarse rope. Her face is pale in the torchlight, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it seems to have swallowed any other expression. She isn't crying or screaming. She seems frozen, a statue of disbelief. She stumbles on the uneven step, and one of the men yanks her forward impatiently. The scene is shockingly public. This is not a quiet, discreet inquiry. It's a performance. It's meant to be seen. As they lead her across the small square towards the lockup, a small room in the cellar of the town hall, doors creak open, faces appear in windows. The hell breath of the town is released in a collective, fearful gasp. This is it. The abstract has become real. The whispers have become a rope. This public spectacle was a crucial part of the process. An arrest for witchcraft was not just a legal action, it was a powerful piece of social theater. It served as a stark warning to everyone else this could be you. It demonstrated the power of the authorities, both secular and religious, and reinforced the reality of the threat they were supposedly combating. The humiliation of the accused began in this very moment, paraded through the streets where she was once a neighbor and a friend. As they pass by the will, you see Martha standing at her doorway. Her arms are crossed, her face a strange mixture of grim satisfaction and something that might be fear. Did she want this specific, brutal reality, or did she just want Elspeth to be a little less fortunate? A little less beautiful? The line between petty jealousy and a death sentence has just been crossed, and the whole town is watching. One of the interesting, and often debated, aspects of these initial accusations is who held the power. While the formal authority lay with magistrates and inquisitors, The initial impetus almost always came from the community itself from below. It was a neighbor's accusation, a rumor, a village consensus of suspicion. Historians call this the communal or popular phase of the witch hunts. The authorities were, in many cases, simply responding to unthen systemating a demand from the populace for action. They weren't always imposing the hunt on an unwilling village. They were often welcomed as saviors who could give form and process to the community's free-floating anxieties. The accusation against Elspeth didn't start with the magistrate, it started with the curdled milk and the whispers at the well. A bizarre but documented detail from some regions was the weighing of the witch. In some places, particularly in the Netherlands, there was a folk belief that a witch, having made a pact with the devil, would be unnaturally light enough to fly on a broomstick. For instance, accused individuals were sometimes taken to a town's official weighing house, the Wog and Weighed. If their weight was proportional to their height and build, they were issued a certificate of innocence. This seems almost rational in its absurdity, but it was a rare exception. For most, the accusation was the beginning of a one-way street, and the only evidence required was the testimony of a resentful neighbor. You watch until they disappear into the dark maw of the town hall. The blacksmith is left standing alone in the square, a powerful man rendered utterly helpless. He looks around, his eyes scanning the watching windows, the shadowy figures in the doorways. His gaze is a mixture of despair and dawning fury. His community has just turned on him. His neighbors have just condemned his wife. The torch-bearing men re-emerge. Their job done. The square empties as quickly as it filled. Doors are bolted again, shutters latched, but the silence that returns is different. It's heavier, colder. It's the silence of a line having been crossed. The line between suspicion and persecution. The first official move has been made. The machine has been switched on. You back away from your window, your own home feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a temporary hiding place. The fear is no longer a vague mist, it's a physical presence in the room with you. It has a name, Elspeth, and it has a destination, the cold, dark cellar of the town hall. The days that follow are thick with a silent, suffocating dread. No one speaks of Elspeth openly, but her absence is a palpable presence. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer is gone, the forge is cold. Her husband paces the confines of his home, a caged animal. His appeals to the magistrate met with cold, procedural indifference. Elspeth is now the property of the law, held in the damp, lightless cellar that serves as the town jail. And down in that cellar, a grim and dehumanizing process is beginning. Before any formal questioning, before the application of any persuasion, the first order of business is the search. The Inquisitor and his assistants are looking for something specific. They are looking for the devil's mark. You can picture the scene, lit by a single, sputtering candle. Elspeth, stripped of her own clothes and forced into a rough burlap shift. The air is cold and smells of wet stone and despair. The Inquisitor, perhaps with a local midwife or another reputable woman of the town assisting, begins the examination. They are not looking for a wound or a scar. They are looking for a small, unnatural mark on the skin. It could be a mole, a birthmark, a moor, a strange freckle, or even just a fleck of discolored skin. According to the demonological texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, when a witch made her pact, the devil would seal the deal by raking his claw across her skin, leaving a permanent mark. This was his brand, his sign of ownership. Crucially, this mark was said to be insensible to pain and would not bleed if pricked. It was the one piece of physical, tangible proof they believed they could find on a witch's body. The search itself is a methodical violation. Every inch of her body is scrutinized. They shave her hair from her head. From her body, as the Malleus advised, looking for hidden marks or demonic charms. The humiliation is the point. It is designed to break her spirit, to strip her of her dignity, to make her feel like an object, a piece of flesh to be examined for signs of corruption. When they find a suspect mark, and they almost always do, for who among us has flawless skin, the real test begins. The Inquisitor pulls out a special tool. It's a long, sharp needle or bodkin, with cold precision. He pushes the needle into the mark. They are watching for two things: a flinch of pain and a drop of blood. If Elspeth cries out, they might dismiss it as a trick. The devil, they believe, can fake the sensation of pain to deceive them. If she doesn't cry out, perhaps from shock, or fear, or because she has fainted, it is seen as proof. But the true prize is if the needle goes in and no blood emerges. This is considered undeniable evidence. This is where a grim piece of historical trickery comes in. A little-known fact is that some professional witch-finders used specially designed needles. These were retractable devices, sometimes called witch prickers. The needle was set in a hollow handle, and with a bit of sleight of hand, the pricker could make the sharp point retract into the handle as it was pushed against the skin. To the observers, it looked like the needle was sinking deep into the flesh. Yet the witch felt nothing and didn't bleed. It was a con, a cheap magic trick used to produce a confession and secure a conviction, for which the pricker would be paid handsomely. It was a fraud designed to prove a fantasy. Historians are still in debate over how widespread these trick devices were. Some accounts from the period expose and condemn these fraudulent prickers, suggesting they were a known problem. But how many convictions were based on this deliberate deception? How many women were condemned by a spring-loaded needle under charlatans' skillful hands? We will never know. It's a chilling reminder that alongside genuine, fanatical belief, there was also cold, calculated fraud driving this engine of persecution. Let's imagine they find a small mole on Elspeth's shoulder. The needle goes in. Perhaps she screams. Perhaps she faints. It doesn't matter. The Inquisitor can interpret the result however he wishes to fit his preconceived conclusion. She did not flinch. He might announce to the magistrate's clerk, who dutifully records the finding. The mark is insensible. The devil has branded his property. This search for the mark is a perfect example of confirmation bias. The Inquisitors were not looking for evidence of innocence, they were looking for confirmation of guilt. Any ambiguity was interpreted in the most sinister light possible. A woman's natural body, with all its small imperfections, was turned into a map of damnation. A particularly cruel twist in this practice was the idea of the invisible mark. If, after a thorough and humiliating search, no visible mark could be found, some inquisitors would claim that the devil was cunning and had made his mark invisible to mortal eyes. They would then proceed to poke the accused body randomly with the needle, and if they found a spot that was, for whatever reason, less sensitive, that would be declared the site of the invisible mark. It was a system designed for a 100% conviction rate. There was no way to be proven innocent. Your body, visible or not, would betray you. Above, in the sunlit world of the town, you know nothing of these specific horrors. But you know that something terrible is happening in that cellar. You know they are testing her. The very idea hangs over the village like a pall of smoke, a silent, shared knowledge of the violation taking place just beneath your feet. The search for the devil's mark has begun. And with it, the transformation of a human being into a collection of incriminating signs. Now that the physical evidence of the devil's mark has been secured or fabricated, the formal interrogation can begin. But this isn't a simple question and answer session. It's a carefully constructed psychological trap, and Elspeth's most damning feature, her beauty, is about to be presented as the prosecution's star exhibit. Imagine the scene again. Elspeth is brought from the cold cellar into a slightly more formal room. Perhaps the magistrate's own office in the town hall. There's a table, a few chairs, a clerk with ink and parchment, ready to record every word. The Inquisitor sits opposite her. His demeanor not one of anger, but of calm, patient reason. This is far more terrifying than rage. It's the confidence of a man who believes he is on a mission from God and already knows the outcome. He doesn't start by asking about curses or subby. He starts with her. Elspeth, he might begin. His voice deceptively gentle. The good people of this town, they speak of you. They say you possess a noteworthy appearance, a comeliness that stands apart. She says nothing. What can she say to agree is to admit to pride. To deny it is to lie, and they will see it as a lie. It's the first knot in the net. He continues, leaning forward slightly. Tell me, in a world of toil and hardship, where does such radiance come from? God gives us burdens to strengthen our souls. He does not often give such worldly gifts without a purpose that is not always his own. He is laying the foundation. He is taking her face, the very thing she was born with, and framing it as unnatural, an anomaly that requires a supernatural explanation. Men look at you. Do they not? He presses on. They stumble over their words. They neglect their duties. Even good, married men. You had a power over them, don't you, H.R.? She est twisting the effect she has on others into an action she has taken. The admiration or lust she might inspire in men is no longer their sin, it is her crime. She is not the object of their gaze, she is the active agent of their temptation. He is recasting her as the serpent in the garden, deliberately using her appearance to lead men astray. This is the central, perverse logic at work in the worldview of the Inquisitor, built upon texts like the Malleus Maleficarum. Beauty is not passive. It's an active force, a form of magic. The power to bewitch or charm was taken literally. When a man was captivated by a beautiful woman, the more extreme theological minds interpreted this not as a metaphor for attraction, but as a literal enchantment, a form of sorcery. Her face was her primary magical tool. The clerks will scratches across the parchment, recording the Inquisitor's leading questions and Elspeth's terrified silence, which will be noted as stubborn refusal to cooperate. Your neighbor's but a sour, the Inquisitor might say, changing tactics, bringing up the whispers from the well. Why, yours is always sweet. Your husband's forge thrives while other businesses struggle. You walk through the woods and return with your cheeks blooming with health, while good Christian children fall ill. It seems fortune follows you, Elspeth, an unnatural fortune. He is weaving a tapestry of condemnation. Her beauty, her small successes, the envy of her neighbors, it's all being threaded together into a single, damning narrative. The narrative is this: she made a deal. She traded her soul to the devil, and in return, he gave her these gifts: the glamour to bewitch men, the curse to harm her neighbors, and the unnatural luck to prosper at their expense. A strange but recurring accusation in some witch trials was the charge of stealing male generative power. A beautiful woman accused of witchcraft might be blamed for a local man's impotence. The logic was that she had magically stolen his virility for her own or her master's demonic purposes. This is a powerful example of how male anxieties about their own failings could be projected onto a convenient female scapegoat. Her desirability was perversely twisted into a supernatural power to emasculate. The academic debate here is fascinating. Some feminist historians argue that this focus on beauty as a weapon was a conscious to love a patriarchal system to control female agency by defining a beautiful, and therefore potentially influential, woman as inherently suspicious. The system could neutralize her power before it even had a chance to be expressed. Other historians take a more culturally grounded view, arguing that in a society saturated with belief in magic, attributing supernatural power to an extraordinary physical attribute was not a cynical ploy, but a genuine, if flawed, attempt to make sense of the world. It wasn't necessarily a conspiracy to suppress women, but a tragic outcome of a specific belief system where magic was the go-to explanation for anything that defied the norm. The Inquisitor leans back, a look of faux pity on his face. The devil has given you a beautiful mask, my child, but we are here to see the true face beneath it. We are here to save your soul, even if your body must be sacrificed. All you have to do is confess the terms of your pact. The trap is now fully set. Her face has been entered into evidence. The admiration she inspired is now proof of enchantment. The envy she provoked has become the testimony of her victims. Her very existence is a crime, and her face is the confession they believe she has been writing every day of her life. She is being tried not for what she has done, but for what she is, and in this court, Being beautiful is the highest form of treason against God. The interrogation you just witnessed was only the first. Gentle face, Elspeth, terrified and confused, has likely denied everything. This, in the eyes of the Inquisitor, is not a sign of innocence. It is a sign of the devil's power. He is giving her the strength to resist, to lie, to protect their pact. The initial failure to get a confession doesn't lead to doubt, it leads to an escalation of methods. The time for soft-spoken, manipulative questions is over. It's time to bring in the specialists. This is when the professional witch hunter truly comes into his own. The man who arrived with the magistrate isn't just an inquisitor, he is an expert. A traveling consultant in the dark arts of extraction. He and his assistants are the ones who know the mechanics of persuasion. The practical application of the theories laid out in the Malleus Maleficarum. They are the technicians of the terror. Their arrival in the town changes everything. It formalizes the fear. What was once a messy, emotional community affair now becomes a cold, procedural process. They bring with them their tools, their books, and an aura of unimpeachable authority. To question their methods is to question the church and the law itself, an act of foolishness few would dare to commit. These men were often not high-ranking church officials. Many were laymen who had carved out a lucrative and powerful niche for themselves. Think of them as freelance contractors of the Holy War. The most famous, or infamous, of these was a 17th century Englishman named Matthew Hopkins, who styled himself the Witchfinder General. In just over a year, he and his company were responsible for the executions of more people for witchcraft than in the entire previous century of English history. He was, for a time, a grand celebrity. So let's follow our specialist as he gets to work on Elspeth. He believes her denial is a demonic trick. His job is to break that demonic protection. He begins with methods designed to weaken the victim physically and mentally. The first, and most common, is sleep deprivation. Elspeth is taken from the cellar and placed in a cell where she is constantly watched. She is not allowed to sit down or lean against a wall. She is forced to walk continuously back and forth in the small space. 2 or 3 guards work in shifts, ensuring she never gets a moment of rest. If she stumbles, they prod her awake. If she starts to drift off on her feet, they shout at her. After 24 hours, the body and mind begin to break down. After 48, reality starts to fray at the edges. Hallucinations begin. The prisoner becomes disoriented, suggestible, desperate for the torture to end. This is precisely the goal. The witch hunter isn't looking for a lucid, rational confession. He is looking for a broken person who will agree to anything. From his perspective, he isn't torturing her, he is wearing down the devil's influence until her true voice can emerge. This practice of watching or walking the witch was particularly insidious because its proponents could claim it was not technically torture. In many legal systems of the time, there were strict rules about how and when torture could be applied. But keeping someone awake, forcing them to walk on paper, it sounded mild. In reality, it was a brutal and highly effective form of psychological torment. This is a key point. Historians emphasize the system was clever. It created legal loopholes and euphemisms for its own cruelty. During this period of deprivation, the questioning continues, but now the questions are relentless, fired at her in her exhausted state. When did you first meet the man in black? Which of your neighbors did you curse? What is the name of your imp? You're familiar. Show us how you fly to the Sabbath. A lesser known but fascinating detail of the interrogations was the obsession with familiars. In British witchcraft belief, particularly, it was thought that the devil would gift a witch a small demonic assistant in the form of an animal, a cat, a toad, a mouse, a spider. This imp would feed on the witch's blood, circling from her devil's mouth, and would carry out her magical bidding. The inquisitors would demand to know the familiar's name and what it looked like. Many confessions, extracted under duress, contain bizarre and pathetic descriptions of these imaginary creatures, cobbled together from the prisoner's exhausted, terrified mind. desperate to give the inquisitors the story they so clearly wanted to hear. The debate among historians here is about the nature of the confessions. For centuries, these detailed confessions were taken at face value as proof of a real, underground witch cult. Today, scholars almost universally agree that the confessions were not genuine memories but were, in fact, co-created by the interrogator and the victim. The inquisitor, with his leading questions and deep knowledge of demonological lore, provided the template. The exhausted, tortured prisoner, desperate to end the pain, then populated that template with details from her own life, the names of her neighbors, the description of her own pet cat, the location of a local landmark for the Sabbath. The confession was not a recollection, it was a script, directed by the hunter and performed by the accused. Back in the cell, Elspeth is stumbling, her mind a fog of pain and exhaustion. The face of her guard blurs with the face of the inquisitor. The questions echo in the small room. Did you dance with the devil? Did you curse the child? Did you sour the milk? He keeps returning to her beauty. Did the devil promise to keep you fair? Is that why you serve him, to avoid the wrinkles and warts of good, honest women? Was it worth your soul, just to keep your pretty face? Her face, the source of the initial suspicion, is now the motive for the crime they are forcing her to admit. After 2 or 3 days of this, she might break, in a haze of delirium. She might whisper yes just to make it stop. That single word is all they need. The clerk, waiting patiently outside, is summoned. A formal confession is written down, full of the lurid details the inquisitor has been feeding her. They will guide her hand to sign it. The specialists have done their job. They have taken a denial and, through systematic, non-torture, have turned it into a full, detailed admission of guilt. The system has worked exactly as designed. The beautiful woman has confessed that her beauty was a demonic gift. The circle of twisted logic is now complete. While the town holds its breath, waiting for the outcome of Elspeth's interrogation, it's easy to get lost in the theological drama and the high-minded horror of it all. But to truly understand why the witch hunts became a widespread, systematic phenomenon that lasted for centuries, you have to look past the crucifixes and the demonology. You have to look at the money. You have to follow the coin. Because witch hunting, for all its religious fervor, was also a business, and in many places, it was a profitable one. Let's step back from Elspeth's cell for a moment and open up the grim ledger book of a typical witch trial. When an accusation was made and the authorities decided to act, a complex and expensive process was set in motion. And who do you think paid for it all? Not the state, not the church, but the accused witch herself, or more accurately, her estate. The moment Elspeth was arrested, a lien was effectively placed on all her family's property. The blacksmith's forge, their small cottage, their livestock, their savings, it was all now on the line. Every single step of the process generated a bill. First, there's the cost of the arrest and the guards. The men who dragged her from her home and the ones who now stand watch at her cell don't work for free. Their wages are tallied up and added to her bill. Then there's her imprisonment. She has to be fed even if it's just stale bread and water. The jailer needs to be paid. The cost of the wood for the fire to heat the interrogation room, the candles to light it, the very rope that bound her hands, it's all meticulously itemized. And then we get to the experts. The traveling witch hunter, like the man currently tormenting Elspeth, didn't work out of pure piety. He had a fee schedule. He charged for his travel expenses, his lodging, and a handsome per diem for his expert services. He might even charge a bonus for each which he successfully convicted. Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled witch-finder general, was notorious for this, charging towns a hefty sum for his investigations. He was essentially a very expensive, and very deadly, consultant. The trial itself was a financial black hole. The magistrate, the clerk who records the proceedings, any messengers sent to and from the regional capital, all their fees were charged to the accused, even the torturer, should his services be required, had a price list, a certain amount for the application of the thumbs bruise, a bit more for the strap party. It was a grotesque lock-up menu of pain, and the victim was paying for every course. This created a powerful and perverse financial incentive for the local authorities. A witch trial could be a way to fill the town coffers. For the individuals involved, the guards, the clerks, the hunters, it was a source of income. This is a point that economic historians of the period stress. The witch hunts created a mini-industry. It wasn't the primary driver everywhere, but in some regions, particularly in the fragmented territories of the Holy Roman Empire, the confiscation of a witch's property was a significant source of revenue for local princes and bishops. One of the most sordid and less discussed aspects of this was the fate of the convicted witches' children. After their mother was executed and their family's property ceased to pay the bills, the children were often left destitute, thrown onto the charity of the parish. In some documented cases, these orphan children were even billed for the cost of their own parents' execution for the wood used to build the pyre and the tar to make it burn. It's a level of bureaucratic cruelty that is difficult to comprehend. This economic reality fuels a long-standing debate among historians. Were the witch hunts primarily driven by religious fanaticism or by economic greed? The answer, as is so often the case in history, is a messy yes. It was a symbiotic relationship. The religious ideology provided the justification, the moral imperative. The economic system provided the fuel and the incentive for it to continue and expand. A prince might genuinely believe he was cleansing his land of evil, but the fact that he could also acquire the property of a wealthy merchant accused of witchcraft certainly didn't hurt. Greed and piety walked hand in hand. This financial angle also helps explain, in part, the focus on women. While women were targeted for deep-seated misogynistic and theological reasons, there was also a practical element. In most of Europe at the time, women, particularly widows or unmarried women, couldn't own property. An elderly widow, living alone, with a nice plot of land and a bit of money saved up, was a tragically perfect target. She was socially vulnerable, fit the stereotype of the old crone, and, conveniently, her conviction would result in a tidy profit for the local authorities. So as Elspeth suffers in her cell, a quiet accounting is already underway. The value of her husband's tools, the worth of their cottage, the few coins they might have saved, it's all being mentally, if not officially, calculated. The charge of witchcraft is not just a death sentence, it's a bankruptcy filing. Her family will be ruined. The town, and the experts it hired, will be paid. The system ensures that it will have the resources to find its next victim. The machine that is consuming Elspeth is also fueling itself with her life. Let's assume for a moment that the sleep deprivation wasn't enough. Let's say that even after days of walking on relentless questioning, some core of Elspeth's spirit holds on. She refuses to sign the confession they've written for her. Her denials are weaker, delirious, but they are still denials. The Inquisitor is not deterred. He is patient. The system has other methods, tools designed to extract the truth that are, by a convenient legal definition, not considered torture. These are the lesser known, but known as cruel, forms of coercion that often preceded the more infamous instruments of pain. It's a descent into a grey area of suffering, a world of torment that carefully skirts the official line. One of the most common of these was the use of pricking, not just to find the devil's mark, but as a form of prolonged torment. The witch hunter would take his needle and, over the course of hours, prick Elspeth's body repeatedly, not deep enough to cause a major wound, but enough to cause constant, agonizing pain. She'd deep prick her arms, her legs, her back, searching for that insensible spot. Each jab of the needle is a fresh spike of pain, a new violation. The sheer monotony of the agony is designed to grind down her will to resist. Another method, deceptively simple, was forced feeding. They would bring her food, often heavily salted fish or bread, but deny her water. The thirst would become an all-consuming fire, a physical need so overwhelming that it eclipses all other thoughts. Then, the Inquisitor would enter, a pitcher of cool water in his hand, confess, he would say, his voice calm. Confess, and you tendering. It's a primal form of manipulation, using the body's own desperate cravings as a weapon against the mind. These methods were part of a broader strategy of creating what modern psychologists would call learned helplessness. The goal was to put the victim in a situation where they have no control over their own body or environment, where pain and discomfort are constant and relief is tied to a single, specific action: confession. The Inquisitor presents himself as the only one who can make the suffering stop. He is both the source of the pain and the sole proprietor of the cure. One particularly bizarre and cruel non-torture was the seediest echo aria, or the dumb chair. While it sounds like something from a Monty Python sketch, it was a real and feared ordeal. The accused would be tied to a chair and then publicly dunked into a cesspool or a river filled with sewage. This was not the swimming test to prove guilt or innocence. This was purely for humiliation and degradation. It was a form of ritualistic defilement, designed to physically and spiritually break the accused, to make them feel as foul and corrupted as the crimes they were accused of. To survive such an ordeal, stinking on shivering, only to be returned to a cold cell for more questions, would shatter the resolve of the strongest person. Historians debate the legalistic minds behind these methods. Were the Inquisitors genuinely convinced that these techniques were not torture? Or were they engaged in a cynical game of semantics to bypass legal restrictions? The consensus among many scholars is that it was a bit of both. The legal systems of the time had very specific definitions of what constituted judicial torture. It usually involved things that shed blood or broke bones and could often only be applied once. Therefore, techniques that caused immense suffering without leaving a permanent mark, like sleep deprivation or pricking, could be classified differently. It was a form of torture light, a way to break a prisoner while maintaining a veneer of procedural correctness. It allowed the Inquisitor to write in his report, "No torture was used to obtain this confession," a statement that was, by his narrow and self-serving definition, true. This period of coercion could go on for days, even weeks. It is a slow, grinding erosion of the self. Elspeth's identity is being systematically dismantled. She is no longer the blacksmith's wife. She is no longer the beautiful woman who gathered wildflowers. She is a prisoner, a body to be manipulated, a will to be broken. Her memories of her own life begin to feel distant, unreal. The only reality is the cell, the pain, the thirst, the exhaustion, and the calm, relentless voice of the Inquisitor, offering her the one and only way out. The confession they are trying to extract is now her only hope of peace. The lines between what is true and what the Inquisitor wants to be true begin to blur in her exhausted mind. Did she meet the devil in the woods at this point? She can't be sure. She remembers walking in the woods. The Inquisitor's voice has filled in the rest of the story so many times it starts to feel like a real memory. His narrative is slowly overwriting her own. Finally, she can endure no more. The thirst, the endless pricking, the bone-deep weariness, it all becomes a single, unbearable weight. "I will sign," she might whisper, her voice a dry rouse. "Just give me water." The Inquisitor nods, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. He has won. He has saved her soul from the devil's grasp. He has done so without, in his view, resorting to torture. He has simply applied the necessary pressure. The clerk is summoned. The pre-written confession, filled with tales of Sabbaths, familiars, and demonic pacts, is placed before her. Her trembling hand signs the document. The system has worked, another which has been identified, and the community is made safer. And it was all done without shedding a single drop of blood yet. But what if even these bloodless torments fail? What if, through some miracle of will, Elspeth continues to resist the system? Has a final, decisive answer for such stubbornness? The ordeal. This is when the pretense of investigation falls away and the matter is placed directly into the hands of God. The most infamous of these was the trial by water, the swimming of the witch. The entire town is assembled at the riverbank just outside the village. The mood is a tense, volatile cocktail of religious fervor, grim duty, and morbid spectacle. It's a public holiday of the most terrifying kind. The magistrate is there, as is Father Thomas and the Inquisitor, their presence lending an air of solemn, official gravity to the proceedings. Elspeth is brought out, her hands and feet bound. She's pale and gaunt from her ordeal in the jail, her eyes hollowed out. She looks like a ghost. They tie a long rope around her waist, the other end held by one of the deputies on the riverbank. This, they claim, is a safety measure to prevent her from drowning. The Inquisitor addresses the crowd, his voice ringing out in the clear air. He explains the theology behind what they are about to witness. Morse, he proclaims, is a pure and holy element, used in the sacred rite of baptism. As such, it is an element of God, and it will reject anything unholy or demonic. An innocent person, being a child of God, will be accepted by the water and will sink. But a witch, having renounced her baptism and pledged herself to the devil, will be repulsed by the sacred element. The water will refuse to accept her. She will float. The logic is a perfect, inescapable trap. Sink and you are innocent, but you will likely drown. Float and you are guilty, and you will be pulled out only to be executed later. There is no outcome here that leads to freedom. It is a judicially sanctioned murder-suicide, presented as a divine test. With a rough shove, they push her into the cold, murky water. The crowd gasps. Leaning forward, all eyes are on the spot where she vanished beneath the surface. For a few agonizing moments, there is nothing but ripples. Is she sinking? Is she innocent? A wave of confusion and perhaps even a flicker of hope might pass through some of the onlookers. But then, she bobs back up to the surface, sputtering, gasping for air. Her heavy woolen clothes trapping pockets of air, her body fighting instinctively for survival. She floats. A roar goes out from the crowd, not a cheer, but a sound of vindicated fear. She floats. A witch. A witch. The deputies on the bank haul on the rope, dragging her back to the muddy shore. She lies there, a sodden, shivering heap, condemned by the very laws of physics. This practice of swimming a witch has a complicated history. It wasn't actually an official part of the Catholic Inquisition's procedure and was often condemned by higher church authorities and more sophisticated legal minds of the time. It was seen as superstitious, unreliable, and a usurpation of God's judgment. Where it flourished was in the realm of folk justice and in regions where legal oversight was weak. It was particularly common in parts of the Holy Roman Empire, Switzerland, and in England under the authority of men like Matthew Hopkins. It was a crude, crowd-pleasing method that delivered a clear, dramatic, and easily understood verdict. A lesser-known fact about the water ordeal is its ancient, pre-Christian origins. Ordeals by water, fire, and combat were common in early Germanic and other tribal legal systems long before the witch hunts. They were a way of resolving disputes when there was no evidence. The witch hunts co-opted this ancient, pagan legal tool and gave it a new, Christian theological veneer. They took a superstitious folk practice and dressed it up in the language of demonology. The academic debate revolves around the why. Why did such an obviously flawed and brutal practice persist for so long? Even when many elites condemned it, some historians argue it was a form of social release valve. In a community gripped by panic, the ordeal provided a dramatic, public, and seemingly definitive climax. It moved the responsibility for the verdict from the human judges to God, cleansing the community's hands. In a way, others see it as a raw expression of mob rule, barely contained within a legalistic framework. The authorities weren't necessarily leading it, they were trying to manage and channel a popular bloodlust they couldn't control. There's also the question of the physics itself. Why did they float as mentioned? Trapped air in heavy clothing was a major factor. Also, the human body, with its fat-content air-filled lungs, is naturally quite buoyant. A struggling person is more likely to float than a passive one. Furthermore, Some accounts suggest the rope tied around the accused's waist was sometimes held in such a way as to prevent them from fully sinking, subtly guiding the outcome the accusers and the crowd already expected. It wasn't a test, it was a rigged demonstration. As Elspeth is dragged from the water, her guilt proven in the eyes of the town, her fate is sealed. The last sliver of hope is extinguished. The ordeal hasn't revealed the truth, it has merely confirmed the pre-existing belief. The water, a symbol of life and purity, has been twisted into an instrument of condemnation. The community, having witnessed God's judgment, is now united in its verdict. The path to the final act of this tragedy is now clear and unopposed. The ordeal is over. Elspeth's guilt has been divinely proven, soaking wet, shivering, and stripped of her last shred of dignity. She is taken back to her cell. The final phase of the legal process can now begin, obtaining the full, detailed confession. She has already been declared a witch now. The authorities need the names of her accomplices. This is one of the most terrifying and destructive aspects of the entire witch hunt phenomenon. A single accusation rarely ended with a single victim. The goal of the Inquisitor was not just to convict one witch, but to uncover the entire coven he believed was operating in the area. A confession was not considered complete until it implicated others. The accusation was designed to be a contagion. Back in the interrogation room, the tone shifts. There is no more pretense of investigation. It is a foregone conclusion. God has proclaimed your guilt. The Inquisitor states, his voice flattened final. Your lies and deceptions are at an end. Your only hope for mercy in the next life is to make a full and honest confession. You did not act alone. Who else was with you at the Sabbath, who danced with you in the woods, who taught you these dark arts? At this point, if she still resists, the official, sanctioned methods of torture are brought into play. The legal justifications have been met. Her guilt is proven, and her refusal to name names is seen as a final act of loyalty to Satan. A malicious attempt to protect his other agents. The restraints are off. The tools are brought in. The infamous thumbs bruise, which would crush the victim's fingers and toes. The leg irons, or Spanish boots, designed to shatter the shin bones. The strap pordue, a pulley system that would hoist the victim into the air by her wrists, which were tied behind her back, dislocating her shoulders with excruciating pain. The application of this torture is cold and clinical. The torturer is a professional, just doing his job. A doctor might even be present, not to prevent suffering, but to advise the Inquisitor on how much the victim can endure before she dies, which would be an inconvenient end to the process of gathering names. Under this unimaginable agony, resistance is impossible. Elspeth's world shrinks to a single, blazing point of pain. The only thought is to make it stop. The Inquisitor's voice drones on, demanding names. Any names. Was it Martha, he might suggest, planting a seed? She envied you. Didn't she? Envy is a sin that opens the door to the devil. Did you see her at the Sabbath? Elspeth, in her agony, might just nod, or moan something that sounds like a yes. The clerk dutifully writes it down. The accused, under questioning, has named Martha, the seamstress, as a fellow witch. One of the truly bizarre, and known aspects of these coerced confessions was the level of fantastic detail they contained. The Inquisitors, steeped in demonological lore, would ask for specifics. What did you eat at the Sabbath? The answer was often disgusting things, like roasted toads or unbaptized infants. What music was played? Usually discordant fiddles or pipes. Did you kiss the devil? Yes. And this was often followed by the Ovesculum in fame, or the kiss of shame, on the devil's posterior, a detail designed to show ultimate subservience and degradation. The prisoner, in their delirium of pain, would patch together answers from the leading questions, local folklore, and their own fevered imagination. The result was a rich, detailed, and utterly fictitious account of a local witch cult. Who else? The Inquisitor presses. The old woman. Agnes, she has the evil eye. Does she not? She was there, wasn't she? Another name is given. Another life is drawn into the vortex. This is how the great chain reaction panics began. The trials at Trier, Fulda, and Bamberg in Germany, and the infamous Salem witch trials in colonial America, were all characterized by this snowballing effect. One accused person, under torture, would name two more. Those two, when arrested and tortured, would name two more. The numbers grew exponentially. Accusations spread from town to town, engulfing entire regions in a wave of terror. The academic debate here is on the mechanics of the spread. Was it a deliberate strategy by the authorities to maximize convictions and property confiscations, or was it an organic, uncontrolled panic that even the authorities eventually grew terrified of? The evidence suggests it was often the latter. In some of the major panics, the accusations began to climb the social ladder. People started accusing mayors, councillors, judges, and even the relatives of the witch hunters themselves. It was only when the elites who had started and managed the process realized they too could be consumed by the fire that they began to put the brakes on. The machine they built had become a monster that threatened to devour its own creators. Back in the cell, the list of names grows. Elspeth has implicated Martha, the sharp-tongued neighbor who first whispered against her. She has named Agnes, the old woman who blamed her for her grandson's cough. She might even name people who were kind to her, their names plucked from a haze of pain simply because they came to mind. She is not a person anymore, she is a vector of contagion. The confession she signs is not just her own death warrant, it is a stack of new arrest warrants. The torture stops. She is given water. They might even dress her wounds. They have what they wanted. The single ember of the Elspeth case has now become a raging fire. The next morning, the guards will be knocking on Martha's door, and then on Agnes's. The story will begin all over again, with new victims, new interrogations, and new lists of names. The confession has become a self-replicating virus, and the town is about to be consumed by the plague. As the list of the accused grows, a distinct pattern emerges. Elspeth, Martha, Agnes. The names are almost exclusively female. The forge remains cold and silent. But the blacksmith, Elspeth's husband, is not arrested. He is graven, ruined, and ostracized. But he is not formally accused of being a warlock. Why, if witchcraft is a pact with the devil, a heresy against God, why does the devil seem to prefer doing business with women? This is one of the most fundamental questions of the entire period, and the answer is a complex and deeply uncomfortable tapestry of theology, biology, and sociology. As you watch the contagion of accusations spread through your town, you are seeing a raw demonstration of early modern misogyny in its most lethal form. Let's go back to the expert authority, the Malleus Maleficarum. Its authors dedicate a whole section to the question, why is it that women are chiefly addicted to evil superstitions? Their reasoning provides a chilling window into the mindset of the time. They argue, with complete seriousness, that women are inherently more wicked than men for several reasons. First, they claim women are more credulous and impressionable, making them easier for the devil to deceive. They are intellectually weaker, like children, and their faith is less robust. Second, they are more carnal, more driven by the lusts of the flesh. The authors of the Malleus spend an almost obsessive amount of time on the supposed sexual relationship between witches and the devil. The Sabbath is portrayed as a giant demonic orgy, and women, being seen as sexually insatiable, are naturally drawn to such depravity. Third, and most bizarrely, they engage in some twisted etymology. They argue that the word femina Latin for woman comes from feind minus, meaning less faith. This is, of course, complete nonsense from a linguistic perspective, but it was presented as a scholarly, pseudo-scientific proof of female spiritual inferiority. Finally, they point to the slip-lines of the tongue. Women, they argued, are gossips, unable to keep secrets. Therefore, when they become witches, they are more likely to argue with their neighbors and, in their anger, use their dark powers to lash out. which is why their witchcraft is more often discovered than men's. The very stereotypes of female behavior were used as evidence of their propensity for evil. This theological framework provided the justification, but the reality on the ground was reinforced by social structures. Women in this period, while not without agency, occupied a subordinate position in society. They were largely excluded from positions of official power in the church, government, and universities. However, they held significant unofficial power in the domestic sphere. They were the healers, the midwives, the preparers of food, the caregivers for the sick and elderly. This gave them a unique and dangerous kind of influence. When a child recovered from a fever after a woman administered an herbal remedy, she was a healer. But if the child died, the same knowledge of herbs that made her a healer could be reframed as the knowledge of poisons that made her a witch. A midwife who successfully delivered a healthy baby was a blessing. But if the baby was stillborn or deformed, she could be accused of having maliciously cursed the child in the womb. The very roles that gave women power in their communities also made them incredibly vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft when things went wrong. While the vast majority of victims were women, historians estimate the figure to be around 75–80% overall. It's a common misconception that men were never accused. They were. Men accused of witchcraft, often called warlocks or sorcerers, tended to fall into specific categories. They were often the husbands or sons of accused witches, swept up in the chain reaction accusations. Sometimes they were social outcasts, vagrants, or those who practiced folk magic for a living. In some rare cases, they were even men of high status, accused by political rivals in a cynical power play. However, the conceptual model of the witch was overwhelmingly female. The scholarly debate on this topic is intense. Early historians often downplayed the gendered aspect, focusing on the religious or social panic. However, since the rise of feminist historiography in the 1970s, it's impossible to discuss the witch hunts without centering the role of misogyny. The debate now is more nuanced. Is it accurate to call the witch hunts a gendercide or a war against women? Most historians are cautious with such terms, as they imply a single, unified, top-down conspiracy. The reality was more complex, a perfect storm where theological misogyny, social anxieties about female power, economic incentives, and legal procedures all converged on women as the primary targets. It wasn't a centrally planned war, but a decentralized, grassroots persecution that the patriarchy enabled, justified, and profited from. A little-known but poignant detail is that in some trials, accused men would try to save themselves by leaning into the stereotype. They would argue in court that they couldn't possibly be a witch of the same power as a woman, because they were men and therefore less susceptible to the devil's wiles. They essentially used the prevailing misogyny as a legal defense strategy, attempting to frame themselves as lesser, more pathetic magical practitioners compared to the female archwitches. As you look around your town, you see this playing out. The men who are now widowers, or whose wives have been imprisoned, are objects of pity and suspicion. But the full force of the legal and theological machine is not aimed at them. It is aimed at the women, the healers, the widows, the beautiful, the sharp-tongued, the old. The campaign to purify the town of evil has, in practice, become a campaign against a specific kind of woman, the one who, in some way, stands apart. The male half of the population is largely acting as the accusers, the guards, the judges, and the spectators. The female half provides the victims. The net of accusations continues to widen, and the inquisitor, seeking to solidify his case, turns to a new and powerful source of evidence: the children. As adults become more hesitant to testify, fearing they might be next, the testimony of children becomes increasingly valuable. They are presented to the court as pure, innocent souls, incapable of deceit and therefore perfect witnesses to the devil's work. You see it happen one afternoon in the market square. Little Meg, the baker's daughter, a girl of about 8 or 9, is being gently questioned by the inquisitor. Her parents stand nearby, their faces a mixture of pride and terror. The Inquisitor's voice is soft and coaxing, the same tone he once used on Elspeth. "Meg," he says, kneeling down to her level. "You are a good, pious girl. Aren't you? You wouldn't lie to a man of God, would you?" The girl shakes her head, her eyes wide. "Tell me about Goody Agnes," he continues, referring to the old woman who was one of the first to be named by Elspeth under torture. "Did she ever give you an apple or a sweet cake?" The girl nods. "Yes, sir, last harvest." "And how did you feel after you ate it?" the Inquisitor prods. "Did your tummy hurt? Did you have bad dreams that night?" He is not asking questions, he is planting suggestions. He is feeding lines to a child who is eager to please the important man asking the questions. The child, her memory hazy, might vaguely recall a stomachache from months ago. In her mind, the two events, prompted by the Inquisitor's authority, now become linked. "Yes," she says, her voice small but clear. "I had a bad dream. I dreamed of a big black dog with red eyes." A murmur goes through the small crowd that is gathered. The black dog, a common form for a demonic familiar to take. The Inquisitor smiles gently. "And did Goody Agnes ever change? Did you ever see her turn into something else?" This is a direct reference to shapeshifters, a keeper attributed to witches. The child is confused, but the Inquisitor's question is so specific, so full of imaginative detail, that it sparks her own imagination. She might have heard stories of such things from the older children. Now, in this high-pressure situation, the stories and the reality begin to merge. I think I saw her turn into a hare once," Meg whispers. "She ran into the woods." It's a fantasy, born of a child's imagination and a desire to give the right answer. But in this courtroom without rules, it is treated as eyewitness testimony. The clerk writes it all down. The child, Meg, testifies under oath that she witnessed the accused, Agnes, shape shift into the form of a hare. The use of child witnesses was a hallmark of some of the most notorious witch trials, including the Salem witch trials, where the afflicted girls and their dramatic courtroom performances were the primary drivers of the panic. This practice overturned centuries of legal precedent. Traditionally, the testimony of children, especially in capital cases, was considered unreliable and was often inadmissible in court. But in the exceptional crime of witchcraft, these rules were set aside. Demonologists argued that the devil could easily corrupt adults, but that the innocent souls of children were a purer conduit for the truth. This led to some truly tragic and bizarre situations. One lesser-known case from the Würzburg witch trials in Germany involved something called the Children's Crusade against the Witches. A group of schoolboys, caught up in the hysteria, began accusing their own families and neighbors. Their testimony was taken so seriously that it led to numerous executions. The boys were celebrated as heroes, paradons of piety, until the panic spiraled so far out of control that the authorities themselves had to step in and put a stop to it. The historical debate here is a sensitive one, where the child witnesses, like the afflicted girls of Salem, cynical manipulators who enjoyed the power and attention their accusations brought them, or were they genuinely convinced of what they were saying? Caught up in a form of mass hysteria or even suffering from psychological or physiological conditions that were misinterpreted as demonic possession, the current consensus leans towards a complex mix. There may have been some elements of youthful power tripping, but it was likely amplified by immense social pressure from the adults around them, combined with a genuine belief in the reality of witchcraft. They were both victims and perpetrators, trapped in a drama they didn't fully understand but were nonetheless driving. The psychological impact on the children themselves was devastating. They were praised for sending people, sometimes their own relatives, to their deaths. They were taught that their fantasies had the power to kill. The long-term trauma of this is hard to fathom. Many of the afflicted girls of Salem later recanted their testimonies and spoke of their deep guilt and regret for the rest of their lives. Back in your town square, little Meg has finished her testimony. The Inquisitor pats her on the head, calling her a brave little soldier for Christ. Her parents pull her away. looking both relieved that the ordeal is over and terrified of the power their child has just wielded. They have just seen how the innocence of a child can be forged into a deadly weapon. The case against Agnes, and others, is now bolstered by this pure and unimpeachable evidence. The word of a child, prompted by a leading question and colored by fireside tales, is now enough to condemn a woman to death. The madness has found its most innocent and most effective voice. The time has come for the main event, the trial itself, but if you're picturing a scene of justice with scales and a blindfold, you need to adjust your expectations. What is about to unfold in the town hall, or perhaps even in the church itself, to give it more gravitas, is not a trial to determine guilt or innocence. It is a public ritual designed to confirm a guilt that has already been decided. It's pure theater. You manage to squeeze into the back of the crowded hall. The air is thick and smells of unwashed bodies, sweat, and fear. The magistrate sits at a raised table, flanked by the Inquisitor and Father Thomas. They are the judges, the jury, and, effectively, the prosecution. There is no lawyer for the defense. To defend a witch is to be seen as an accomplice to witchcraft, a risk almost no one is willing to take. The accused are brought in, one by one. First, Elspeth. She's a shadow of her from herself. Her beautiful hair has been crudely hacked off. She is thin, bruised, and her eyes are vacant, staring into a distance only she can see. Then comes Martha, the seamstress, her sharp features now slack with terror. And finally, old Agnes, her body stooped, looking frail and utterly bewildered. The proceedings begin. The clerk reads the charges. A long, rambling document filled with theological jargon and lurid accusations. He speaks of diabolical pacts, of sabbaths in the woods, of shapeshifters and curses. Then, the evidence is presented. The Inquisitor calmly recounts his findings, the discovery of the devil's mark on Elspeth's shoulder. He reads from her confession, the one obtained through exhaustion and agony. Her voice a monotone drone that gives the fantastical tales a chilling air of fact. He speaks of how she implicated the others. He then presents the testimony from the neighbors. A man stands up and nervously recounts how his cow had dried the day after Martha had complimented it. Another tearfully describes how his wife's bread refused to rise after Agnes had walked past their window. It's a parade of misfortune, superstition, and petty grievance, all recontextuated as evidence of deliberate, malevolent magic. No one questions whether the cow was simply sick or the oven wasn't hot enough. In this room, there is only one explanation for life's random cruelties: witchcraft. Then, little Meg is brought forward to repeat her story about the black dog and Agnes turning into a hare. She recites her lines, prompted by the Inquisitor, her small voice filling the silent hall. It is devastatingly effective. One of the most fundamentally unjust aspects of a witch trial was the concept of spectral evidence. This was particularly prominent in the Salem trials. It meant that a witness could testify that the accused spectre, their spirit or ghostly shape, had appeared to them and tormented them, even if their physical body was somewhere else entirely. This is, by its very nature, an unfalsifiable claim. How can Elspeth prove that her spirit wasn't pinching someone in their sleep? It's a charge that is impossible to defend against. The court is admitting dreams and visions as hard evidence. When it's Elspeth's turn to speak, her voice is a barely audible whisper. The magistrate asks her if the confession read to the court is true. She looks at the Inquisitor, at the instruments of torture that might be waiting for her if she recontests. She looks at the faces of her neighbors, twisted with fear and hatred. What choice does she have? She nods. A yes means a quicker death. A no means a return to the agony, with the same result in the end. This is a point of legal and historical debate. Did any of the accused genuinely come to believe in their own guilt? It sounds impossible. But some scholars argue that under the combined pressure of religious indoctrination, psychological and physical torture, and social isolation, some victims may have experienced a complete breakdown of their own reality. They were told so forcefully and so often that they were witches. Their own minds may have fractured and accepted the narrative as true. They might have confessed not just to stop the pain, but because, in their broken state, They truly believed they were the monsters everyone said they were. A little known but fascinating feature of some European witch trials was the role of the accused's advocate or witch's lawyer. In some more legally sophisticated regions, the accused was theoretically granted a lawyer. However, these lawyers operated under impossible constraints. They were often forbidden from meeting with their client alone. They were not allowed to challenge the core belief in witchcraft itself. Their only hope was to argue on procedural grounds that the torture was applied incorrectly, or that a witness was a known personal enemy of the accused. Men like Johann Weyer, a 16th century Dutch physician, wrote critiques of the trials, but they were the brave and rare exception. For else within the women of your town, there is no such advocate. The trial is a foregone conclusion. The magistrate confers briefly with the inquisitor and the priest. A solemn nod passing between them, he stands and pronounces the verdict. Guilty, all of them. Guilty of the highest treason against God and man. The sentence is death. A wave of something unreadable washes over the crowd, a mix of relief, terror, and a grim, righteous satisfaction. Justice has been served. The town will be cleansed. The scapegoats have been chosen. Their guilt has been ritually confirmed, and their fate has been sealed. The theater is over. All that remains is the final act. In the oppressive atmosphere of the courtroom, where accusation equals guilt, you might wonder if anyone ever tried to push back. Did anyone ever stand up and say, "This is wrong"? The answer is yes. But it was one of the most dangerous things a person could do. To defend an accused which was to paint a target on your own back. Let's imagine, for a moment, a man of conscience in your town. Perhaps it's a young, university-educated physician who has just moved to the area. He has read the classics and has a more rational, scientific view of the world. He sees old Agnes not as a malevolent witch, but as a frail, elderly woman suffering from senile dementia. He sees the possessed children not as victims of demonic attack, but as suggestible youths caught up in a shared delusion. He decides to speak out. He might try to approach the magistrate privately, to reason with him. "Sir," he might say, "the evidence you are using is flawed. Spectral evidence is not tangible. Confessions obtained under duress are not reliable. There are natural explanations for these phenomena." The magistrate, a man of his time, would likely listen with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. "Are you suggesting," he might reply, his voice cold, "that the devil is not real? Are you suggesting that these learned inquisitors and men of God are mistaken to deny the existence of witchcraft as a heresy in itself?" Doctor. The doctor is immediately placed in an impossible position. His skepticism is not seen as rational, it is seen as blasphemous. The Malleus Maleficarum and other texts were very clear on this point. One of the devil's greatest tricks was to convince people that he, and therefore witches, didn't exist. So the doctor's rational arguments are twisted into proof that he himself has been deceived by Satan. Or worse, is one of his agents trying to protect the coven. Undeterred, our brave doctor might try to act as an unofficial advocate for one of the accused. Let's say he attempts to provide an alternative explanation for the evidence against Martha, the seamstress. Her neighbor's cow went dry. He might argue in the public square. "But my examination shows the beast has a common ailment of the stomach. It has nothing to do with the curse." This intervention would be seen as a direct challenge to the official narrative. The inquisitor would turn his cold eyes on the doctor. "How interesting," he might say, "that you are so eager to defend this woman. What is your connection to her? Perhaps you were also at the Sabbath, enjoying the devil's hospitality. It takes a sorcerer to defend a witch." The accusation is now in the air. The crowd, already primed for suspicion, begins to look at the doctor differently. His education, once a mark of status, now becomes a sign of arrogance and godlessness. His attempts to introduce logic and reason are perceived as devilish tricks, designed to obscure the simple, terrible truth. This was the fate of many real-life critics of the witch hunts. Friedrich Spee, a 17th century German Jesuit priest, served as a confessor to accused witches. He listened to their stories, heard their protestations of innocence, and accompanied them to their executions. The experience shattered him. He later wrote a book, CRTO Criminal Is, in which he anonymously and scathingly condemned the entire process. He argued that the use of torture guaranteed that anyone, no matter how innocent, would eventually confess. He famously wrote, "Often I have thought that the only reason we are not all wizards is due to the fact that we have not all been tortured." He had to publish his work anonymously because he knew that to openly challenge the system would lead to his own arrest and execution. A lesser known, and particularly tragic, detail is the fate of the family members who tried to defend their loved ones. Elspeth's husband, the blacksmith, is a perfect example. If he were to loudly and persistently proclaim his wife's innocence, he would quickly go from being a grieving husband to a primary suspect. The logic was simple: if his wife is a witch, she surely would have tried to convert him. His passionate defense of her is merely a ruse to protect their shared secret. His love and loyalty would be twisted into evidence of his own damnation. This is why so many family members, after an initial protest, fell into a terrified silence. To fight was to invite their own destruction. The scholarly debate here centers on the motivations of the defenders. Were they true Enlightenment figures, born a century too early, who fought for reason and human rights, or were their motivations more personal and less philosophical? The consensus is that it was a mix. Some, like Spee, were driven by a crisis of conscience and a profound sense of justice. Others were simply trying to save a friend or family member and got caught in the gears of the machine. And some were legal professionals who, while not doubting the existence of witchcraft, were horrified by the complete abandonment of legal standards and due process. They weren't fighting the belief, but the brutal and illogical way it was being prosecuted. Our fictional doctor, having failed at every turn, now faces a terrible choice. He can fall silent, swallow his conscience, and watch as innocent women are led to their deaths, or he can persist, knowing that with every word he speaks in their defense, the pyre being built for them grows large enough to include him as well. The system was a closed loop, a self-perpetuating bubble of paranoia. It was designed not just to punish the accused, but to silence dissent. The very act of questioning the process was defined by the process itself as a crime. It created a chilling consensus, where the majority remained silent out of fear, and the few who dared to speak were systematically eliminated. The path to the execution ground is paved with the silence of good people. The verdict is in, and a new, more intimate kind of horror begins to unfold. The women are in their cells, awaiting their final sentence. The legal drama is over, but the personal betrayals are just beginning to surface. In a community gripped by such intense fear, the bonds of friendship, loyalty, and even family are tested to their breaking point, and they often shatter. Let's return to the blacksmith. He is a man broken. His wife has been condemned. His business is ruined. His name is now synonymous with disgrace and evil. He sits alone in his house, the silence of the cold forge a constant reminder of his loss. There's a knock at the door. It's a neighbor. Someone he has known his entire life. Someone whose tools he has sharpened and whose plow he has mended. The neighbor doesn't meet his eyes. He shuffles his feet. "I'm sorry, Thomas," he mutters. "But my wife, she's afraid. We can't have our children playing near this house anymore. It's not safe." He's not just offering condolences, he's severing a tie. He's drawing a line in the sand, placing the blacksmith and his cursed household firmly on the other side. This is the social death that precedes the physical one. The accused and their families are surgically excised from the community. People cross the street to avoid them. Old friends suddenly don't recognize them at the market. They become invisible, untouchable. This isolation is not just cruel, it's a survival mechanism for everyone else. To associate with the condemned is to risk contamination. The fear is that witchcraft is like a disease, and proximity can lead to infection, or at least to accusation. The most painful betrayals often came from within the family itself. Imagine Martha, the seamstress, in her cell. She was accused by Elspeth, someone she envied. Now, she is facing her own trial. The Inquisitor, seeking to strengthen his case against her, brings in her own husband for questioning. The man is terrified. He loves his wife, but he also loves his children and his own life. The Inquisitor presents him with a terrible, implicit choice: stand by your wife and risk being accused as her accomplice, or save yourself and your children by confirming her guilt. Your wife has a sharp tongue, doesn't she? The Inquisitor might ask. She argues with the neighbors. Has she ever muttered threats under her breath? Has she ever seemed unnaturally angry? The husband thinks of all the petty arguments, the normal frustrations of a hard life. In this context, they all take on a sinister new meaning. He remembers a time she got into a shouting match with a neighbor, and a week later that neighbor's prize-winning pig took sick. At the time, it was a coincidence. Now, it looks like a curse. Yes, he might whisper, sacrificing his wife to save his family. She has a terrible temper. She wished to blight on Goodman Brown's field once. He has just signed his wife's death warrant. He will go home and have to look his children in the eye, knowing he has just made them motherless to save them from being orphaned entirely. It's a monstrous, impossible choice, and the witch hunt system was designed to force it upon people. One of the most chilling and well-documented forms of betrayal came during the chain reaction panics, when a mother was arrested and tortured. She might, in her agony, name her own daughter as a fellow witch. This seems unthinkable, but it happened. Why, some historians suggest that in their pain-addled minds, some women may have believed that a swift death by execution was more merciful than a life of shame, poverty, and ostracism that their daughters would face as the child of a convicted witch. It was a twisted, horrific act of what they may have perceived as maternal protection. This leads to a complex historical debate about human nature under pressure. Is the impulse for self-preservation stronger than the bonds of love and loyalty? The witch trials provide a grim, large-scale case study. While there were heroic instances of people refusing to betray their loved ones, the vast number of confessions that implicated friends and family suggests that, for many, the instinct to survive was overwhelming. It's easy for us, from the safety of our time, to judge the husband who betrayed his wife. But faced with the reality of the thumbs bruise and the pyre, how many of us would have the courage to make a different choice? The betrayal wasn't just driven by fear, it was also driven by a desperate attempt to make sense of the tragedy. For the blacksmith, it might be easier to believe, on some level, that his beautiful wife really did have a secret, dark side. To believe she was truly a witch is, in a strange way, less painful than accepting the alternative that his world is completely random, unjust, and insane, and that his neighbors and his church would murder an innocent woman for no reason at all. Believing in her guilt gives the horror a framework, a terrible kind of logic. As the day of the execution approaches, the town is a web of fractured relationships and quiet betrayals. The neighbor shuns the blacksmith. The husband condemns his wife. The mother implicates her daughter. The community is eating itself alive, sacrificing its own members in a desperate attempt to appease a phantom threat. The real poison isn't witchcraft, it's the fear that forces good people to do terrible things to survive. The day arrives. It's a bright, clear morning, the kind that feels cruelly indifferent to the grim business at hand. The execution is a public event, and the entire town, along with people from the surrounding villages, begins to gather. There's a strange, almost festive atmosphere mixed with the dread. This is a major event, a piece of high drama, and a powerful moral lesson all rolled into one. The condemned women Elspeth, Martha, and Agnes are led out from the town hall. This is the beginning of the final ritual of humiliation, the procession to the execution site. They are dressed in simple, coarse shifts, the same clothes they've worn for weeks. Their hands are bound tightly in front of them. A placard might be hung around each of their necks, bearing the single word, Hex, witch. A priest, perhaps Father Thomas, walks at the head of the procession, holding a crucifix aloft. The magistrate and the inquisitor walk behind him, their faces stern and righteous. Then come the women, flanked by guards, and behind them, the town follows. You find yourself swept up in the crowd, moving slowly towards the field outside the town walls where the pyres have been built. The journey is agonizingly slow. This is not a quick march to the gallows. It's a performance, designed to be seen. It's the town's last chance to look upon the faces of evil, to contemplate their sins, and to be thankful for their own piety. You watch the faces of the people around you. There's no single emotion. You see open hatred and morbid curiosity on some faces. On others, you see fear, the fear that this could have been them. You see children, held up on their father's shoulders to get a better view, their eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and confusion. And on a few faces, hidden in the back of the crowd, you see grief and shame. You see the blacksmith, his face a stone mask of despair. You see Martha's husband, his eyes fixed on the ground, unable to watch the woman he condemned. This public procession, or ride to the stake, was a critical part of the punishment. It was a form of psychological warfare. For the condemned, it was the ultimate degradation, being paraded as a monster through the streets where they once lived and shopped and raised their children. For the public, it was a powerful reinforcement of the social order. It was a visual demonstration that the authorities were in control, that evil had been rooted out, and that justice, however brutal, was being done. As they passed the church, the bells begin to toll, not the cheerful ringing of a Sunday service, but a slow, heavy, monotonous knell. The sound hangs in the air, a soundtrack for the March of the Damned. The priest might stop and offer a final prayer, urging the women to make one last confession, to repent and save their souls, even if their bodies are forfeit. A lesser-known detail of these processions is the practice of shaming. The crowd was often encouraged to participate in the humiliation. People would spit at the condemned, throw mud or refuse at them, and scream insults. This wasn't just random mob behavior, it was often seen as a legitimate part of the punishment, a way for the community to ritually cleanse itself by casting its sins and fears onto the scapegoats. It was a final, violent act of othering, making it clear that these women were no longer part of the human community. The historical debate here often focuses on the psychology of the crowd, what turns a group of ordinary neighbors into a jeering, hateful mob. Historians and sociologists point to concepts like de-individuation, the loss of self-awareness and personal responsibility that can occur in a large group. In the crowd, an individual's sense of morality can be subsumed by the collective emotion. They are no longer a person, they are part of the mob. And the mob has its own logic, its own primal energy. The presence of authority figures like the priest and the magistrate gives this mob behavior a stamp of approval, making it feel righteous rather than cruel. You watch Elspeth as she stumbles along the path. Her face, once the catalyst for this entire tragedy, is now almost unrecognizable. It's streaked with dirt. Her eyes are dull with trauma. The beauty that was twisted into evidence of a demonic pact is gone, erased by the very process that condemned it. There is a terrible, final irony in that. The system that was so obsessed with her face has ended up destroying it. Finally, the procession reaches the field. Three dark shapes stand starkly against the blue sky, the stakes, with piles of wooden straw arranged neatly at their bases. The crowd falls silent, a wave of anticipation washing over them. The final act of the play is about to begin. The slow, humiliating walk is over, the moment that everyone has been waiting for, with a mixture of terror and righteous expectation, has arrived. The crowd forms a wide, silent circle around the three stakes. The air is still. The only sounds are the shuffling of feet, the tolling of the distant church bell, and the soft whisper of the wind through the dry grass. This is the moment where the abstract horror of the past few weeks becomes a stark, physical reality. The guards lead the three women to the stakes. Old Agnes is weeping silently, her body trembling. Martha is staring at the ground, her face a mask of numb resignation. But Elspeth, she lifts her head. Her vacant eyes scan the crowd. not with anger or fear, but with a kind of profound, empty detachment. Is she looking for her husband? Is she seeing the faces of the neighbors who condemned her, or is she simply not there anymore? Her mind having retreated to a place where none of this can touch her. They are tied to the stakes with coarse ropes, their backs pressed against the rough wood. The executioner, a man whose face is hidden by a hood, moves with a practiced, methodical efficiency. This is his trade. He checks the ropes, adds a bit more straw around their feet. He is a craftsman preparing his materials. The method of execution for witchcraft varied by region. In England, the traditional punishment was hanging, but on the European continent, particularly in the Holy Roman Empire, France, and Switzerland, the preferred method was burning. The choice of fire was deeply symbolic. Theologically, fire was seen as a purifying element. By burning the witch's body, the authorities believed they were not only executing a criminal, but also destroying the physical vessel of corruption, cleansing the community through this act of ritual purification. It was also believed to be the only way to ensure the witch could not rise from the grave to continue her malevolent work. It was an execution for this world and an exorcism for the next. The goal was total annihilation. There's a grim, and often debated, point of historical detail here. Was the victim alive when the flames reached them in some cases? As a small act of mercy, the executioner was permitted to strangle the condemned with a garrote or a rope just before the fire was lit. In other, more merciful jurisdictions, a bag of gunpowder might be tied around the victim's neck. The idea was that the gunpowder would explode quickly, ending their suffering instantly. However, this was not always guaranteed and often depended on the mood of the magistrate or the size of the bribe paid by the victim's family. In many cases, especially during the height of the panics, this mercy was denied. The full, agonizing punishment of the flames was considered a necessary part of the spectacle and a just reward for their crimes. The priest, Father Thomas, steps forward one last time. He holds up the crucifix and, in a loud voice, gives the women a final chance to confess their sins and repent. It's the last step in the ritual. Their public repentance would serve as the final validation of the entire process. A final proof that the court was right. Agnes, in a quavering voice, begins to recite a prayer. Martha remains silent, her head bowed. Elspeth says nothing. Her silence is her final, small act of defiance. Then, the magistrate gives a signal. The executioner takes a torch from one of the guards. He walks to the first pyre, that of Agnes. He touches the flame to the dry straw. It catches instantly. A crackle, a puff of smoke, and then a rush of orange flame. The crowd lets out a collective gasp. He moves to the next pyre, and then the next. Within moments, all three are alight. The smoke billows up, thick and acrid, carrying the scent of burning wood and something else, something sickeningly organic. The flames lick upwards, engulfing the woman's feet, then their legs. This is the part of the story where I would draw a veil. We do not need to linger on the specifics of the suffering. It is enough to know that it was real, and it was horrific. It's enough to understand that this was the calculated, logical endpoint of the whispers that began at the village well, from envy and suspicion to accusation and torture. The knell to this. We will focus instead on the crowd, on the blacksmith, who finally turns his head away, a silent scream trapped in his throat, on Martha's husband, who falls to his knees, on little Meg, the child witness, who buries her face in her mother's skirt, the reality of what she has done crashing down on her in a wave of incomprehensible terror. A lesser-known psychological aspect of these events is what came after. Many accounts from the period describe a kind of post-execution depression or anxiety that would settle over a town. The catharsis they hoped for didn't always materialize. Instead, having witnessed such profound brutality, the community was often left with a residue of guilt, fear, and trauma. They had killed the witches, but the fear of the devil, and the fear of each other, remained. The fire had not purified them, it had only left a scar. The fire consumes everything. The wood, the straw, the ropes, the bodies. It burns until there is nothing left but 3 charred stakes, blackened bones, and a pile of grey ash. The spectacle is over. The evil has been expunged. The sun begins to set, casting long shadows across the execution field. The crowd, in their silence, begins to disperse, heading back to their homes, back to their lives. But nothing will be the same. The fire has burned a hole in the heart of the town. The smoke has cleared, but a permanent haze now hangs over the town. It's a haze of memory, of guilt, of broken trust. The executions were supposed to be a conclusion, a cathartic release that would cleanse the community and restore divine order. But the reality is far messier. The town is not healed, it is profoundly wounded. You walk through the streets in the days that follow, and the silence is different now. It's not the tense, watchful silence of the hunt, but the hollow, aching silence of its aftermath. The blacksmith's forge remains cold. He has become a recluse, a ghost in his own home, a living monument to the town's crime. Martha's husband tries to carry on, but his eyes are haunted. He can't look his neighbors in the face. Then they can't look at him. Every glance is a reminder of his betrayal. Old Agnes' small cottage stands empty, its windows like vacant eyes. Children are told not to go near it, that it's a place of evil. But the story is already changing from a tale of a witch to a sad story of a lonely old woman. The social fabric, once tightly woven, is now riddled with holes. The whispers that condemned Elspeth and the others have been replaced by a new kind of whisper, the harsh, guilty kind. People remember their own role in the tragedy. The woman who complained about her sour butter, the man who blamed Agnes for his sick child, the neighbor who shunned the blacksmith. They were all small cogs in the machine. And now they have to live with the machine's bloody work. This is the long-term, collective trauma that historians often talk about. A witch hunt didn't just eliminate a few individuals, it poisoned the entire community. Well, how can you trust your neighbor when you have seen how easily neighbor can turn against neighbor? How can you have faith in justice when you have seen it twisted into a tool of murder, the very foundations of the community trust? Mutual support. Shared faith had been shaken to their core. An interesting and less discussed consequence of major witch hunts was the economic impact. While the authorities may have profited from confiscated property, the town itself often suffered. The loss of skilled artisans like the blacksmith, the disruption of local trade, the lingering fear that discouraged outsiders from settling or trading there. It could lead to a long period of economic stagnation. The hunt that was supposed to solve the community's problems failed. Crops, sick livestock often ended up creating more of them. The town had burned its witches, but it had also burned its own social and economic capital. The children are perhaps the most visibly scarred. Little Meg, who was celebrated as a hero for her testimony, now has nightmares. She avoids the market square, avoids the Inquisitor and the priest. The other children, who once listened to her with awe, now look at her with a mixture of fear and pity. They know, on some instinctive level, that her words had the power to kill. The innocence of an entire generation has been curdled. There's a fascinating, and still debated, historical question about how communities moved on from these events. Did they simply try to forget? Did they rationalize their actions in some cases? There was a backlash. A few years later, a new magistrate might come to power, review the trial records, and declare the executor to be innocent. Memorials might be erected, but this was rare. More often, a collective amnesia would set in. The story would be quietly rewritten. The victims would be remembered not as innocent neighbors, but as genuine, if pathetic, witches. This was a necessary psychological defense mechanism for the community. It was easier to believe they had done a hard but necessary thing than to admit they had participated in a collective, murderous delusion. One subtle sign of the lingering trauma is an increased obsession with religious piety and superstition. People might attend church more fervently, desperate to prove their righteousness and ward off any lingering evil. They might carve more protective symbols into their homes, a sign of a community that no longer feels safe. The fear that sparked the hunt hasn't vanished, it has just been driven deeper underground, where it will fester. As you go about your daily chores, the ghosts of the executed women are everywhere. You see them at the well where the whispers started. You see them in the empty pews at church. You see their faces in the flickering fire of your own hearth. They are a permanent part of the town's story now. A silent, ever-present reminder of a time when fear, envy, and a lust for righteous certainty burned brighter than reason, mercy, or truth. The fire in the field has gone out, but the one in the town's soul will smolder for generations. For a long time. It feels like the darkness will last forever. The fear and guilt hang so heavily that it seems impossible for the sun to ever truly break through. But even in the deepest night of this collective madness, small, scattered glimmers of reason begin to appear. They are not a sudden dawn, but faint, flickering candles in a vast, dark room. The change doesn't start with a dramatic rebellion. It starts quietly, in the minds of a few individuals who begin to question the very foundation of the nightmare. Perhaps it begins with our fictional doctor, the one who tried to speak out and was silenced. He doesn't give up, he just becomes more careful. He continues his studies, not of demonology, but of the human body and mind. He starts to keep a private journal, documenting the cases of possession he observes, but using a new language. He writes not of demons, but of melancholy, hysteria, and delusions of the mind. He is, in his own small way, helping to build the vocabulary of what will one day become psychology and psychiatry. In another town, a judge, a man who has presided over dozens of trials and sent many to their deaths, begins to have a crisis of conscience. He starts to notice the patterns that Friedrich Spee wrote about. He sees that the confessions are all strangely similar, full of the same lurid details, as if they were following a script. He notices that when torture is not used, there are no confessions. He realizes that he has been condemning people based on evidence that the process itself creates. He can't undo the deaths he is responsible for, but he can change his own actions. He begins to demand a higher standard of proof. He starts throwing out cases that rely solely on spectral evidence or coerced confessions. He doesn't announce a revolution, he just quietly starts applying the brakes to the machine. This reflects a real historical shift. The decline of the witch hunts was not caused by a single event, but by a slow, gradual change in elite thinking. Legal scholars, theologians, and early scientists began to publicly challenge the flawed logic and brutal methods of the hunters. One of the most significant figures was Balthasar Bekker, a Dutch theologian who, in his 1691 book The Enchanted World, mounted a full-scale assault on the very belief in witchcraft. He used the Bible itself to argue that God was sovereign and would not allow the devil such power to interfere in the world. He argued that what people called witchcraft was simply misunderstood natural phenomena or mental illness. His book was a sensation and was furiously condemned by traditionalists, but it opened a door that could not be closed again. He gave a theological permission slip for skepticism. A fascinating, and less dramatic, contributor to the decline was the rise of bureaucracy. As states became more centralized and powerful, local courts and freelance witch hunters came under greater scrutiny from a central legal authority. Kings and high courts began to demand that all capital cases, including witchcraft, be sent to them for appeal. These higher courts, being further removed from the local panic and staffed by more educated lawyers, were far more likely to be skeptical. They would review the trial records from a town like yours and be appalled by the lack of due process, the reliance on child witnesses, and the use of torture. They began to systematically overturn convictions. The witch hunts didn't end just because people stopped believing they ended, in part, because they became bureaucratically inconvenient and legally embarrassing for the modernizing state. The historical debate here is about the primary engine of this change. Was it the top-down influence of intellectuals and governments imposing a new, more rational worldview, or was it a bottom-up change? As ordinary people simply grew exhausted and disgusted with the endless cycle of bloodshed and accusation, the most likely answer is that both were happening at once. The intellectual arguments of men like Becker gave a framework and a language to a growing public weariness. People saw their communities being torn apart, and they started to become numb to the preachers' cries of wolf. The monster they had been fighting for centuries had caused far more damage than any supposed which ever could. Back in your town, you start to notice the subtle shifts. A traveling preacher comes through, and his sermon is all about God's mercy and forgiveness, with no mention of the devil's wiles. A new magistrate is appointed, and when a woman accuses her neighbor of souring her milk, he fines her for slander instead of opening a witchcraft investigation. Little Meg, now a young woman, openly weeps in church on the anniversary of the executions, and people comfort her instead of shunning her. The word which starts to lose some of its terrifying power. It begins to sound a little old-fashioned, a little superstitious. It's not that everyone suddenly becomes a rational skeptic overnight. The belief in magic and the devil doesn't just vanish, but the willingness to act on that belief in a legal, homicidal way begins to fade. The fire in the field has long gone out. And now, finally, the fever in the mind is starting to break. The candle of reason, once so small and flickering, is slowly, painstakingly, beginning to win against the dark. Years pass. A new generation is born in your town, a generation that did not witness the executions, that only knows the story as a dark local legend whispered by their grandparents. The charred stakes in the field have long since rotted away or been hauled off for firewood. The event that once consumed the entire community has receded into the past, becoming a part of history. So how and why did the great fire of the witch hunts finally, definitively, burn itself out? We've seen the glimmers of reason, the rise of legal oversight, and the sheer exhaustion of the people. But the final quenching of the flames was tied to a much larger shift in the whole of European thought, a revolution of the mind that we now call the Enlightenment. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, a new philosophy began to take hold among the educated classes. Thinkers like Isaac Newton were demonstrating that the universe was not a chaotic, magical place, but an orderly system governed by rational, predictable laws. This new scientific worldview left less and less room for the supernatural. A hailstorm was no longer seen as the work of a coven of witches, but as a meteorological event that could be studied and understood. An illness was not a demonic curse, but a biological process that could potentially be cured by medicine, not prayer or counter spells. This new way of thinking fundamentally changed the definition of evidence. The old system, which accepted dreams, spectral visions, and coerced confessions as proof, started to look ridiculous to a mind trained in logic and empirical observation. A judge in 1750 had a completely different understanding of the world than a judge in 1550. He would demand physical proof, credible witnesses, and logical consistency standards that no witch trial could ever meet. This disenchantment of the world, as the sociologist Max Weber would later call it, was the intellectual death knell for the witch trials. The belief system that had supported the hunts was not necessarily proven false, it just became irrelevant, old-fashioned, and intellectually embarrassing. But it wasn't just a top-down movement of philosophers. The changes were felt on the ground, too. For instance, improvements in agriculture and the beginning of a more stable climate after the Little Ice Age meant fewer famines and less desperation. When crops are healthy and livestock are thriving, people are less inclined to look for a magical scapegoat to blame for their misfortunes. A full belly is a surprisingly effective antidote to superstition. A lesser-known but crucial factor was the end of the Great Religious Wars. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 brought a close to the most violent era of Catholic-Protestant conflict. As religious tensions eased, so did the obsessive focus on heresy and demonic influence. The states that emerged were more concerned with earthly matters like trade, taxation, and border security than with the spiritual purity of their subjects. The devil was no longer public enemy number one, he was demoted to a theological problem. Historians still debate which of these factors was the most important. Was it science? Was it the rise of the modern state? Was it economic stability? The consensus is that there was no single magic bullet that killed the witch hunts. It was a slow, multifaceted process where all these forces worked together. The intellectual, legal, political, and economic ground shifted, and the entire edifice of the witch hunt, which had seemed so solid and terrifying for centuries, simply crumbled under its own weight because its foundations had rotted away. The last official execution for witchcraft in England took place in 1684. In Scotland, it was 1727. In the Holy Roman Empire, the last state-sanctioned execution was in 1775. The laws themselves were gradually repealed in 1735. Great Britain passed a new Witchcraft Act that completely reversed the old logic. The new law made it a crime not to be a witch, but to pretend to be a witch to defraud people. The crime was no longer sorcery, it was fraud. This legal shift is a perfect marker of the end of an era. The state was no longer in the business of hunting demons, it was in the business of prosecuting con artists. Back in your town, life has moved on. The story of Elspeth, the beautiful woman condemned for her face, has become a cautionary tale, but the lesson has changed. For your ancestors, the lesson was beware the devil's wiles. For your generation, the lesson is beware the madness of crowds. The great European witch hunt did not end with the triumphant victory of good over evil. It just stopped. It faded away, a fever that finally broke, leaving the patient exhausted, scarred, but alive. The world had changed, and the shadows that had seemed so real and so threatening were revealed to be just that, shadows. The long, dark night of the hunt was, at last, over. The silence that descends after a storm is profound. The laws have been changed, the pyres have turned to dust, and the intellectual fever has broken. The era of the great European witch hunts is over, and in the quiet aftermath, we are left to walk through the graveyard of history and try to count the dead. How many lives were consumed by this centuries-long panic? This is one of the most haunting and debated questions for historians of the period. For a long time, sensationalist writers threw around staggering numbers, millions, even tens of millions. These figures were often based on flimsy evidence and were part of a narrative to portray the Dark Ages as even darker than they were. Modern, systematic research has significantly revised these numbers downwards. But the reality is no less horrifying. The scholarly consensus now places the total number of executions across Europe between roughly 40. 0 and 50, ling ling ling. This number, while smaller than the exaggerated millions, is staggering in its own right. It's a city's worth of people, executed one by one, in small towns and villages, over the course of several generations. Each one of those 50, Jaro was a person with a life, a family, a story, a person like Elspeth, whose beauty became her crime, a person like Martha, whose sharp tongue was twisted into a curse, a person like Agnes, whose old age and senility were mistaken for demonic communion. The geographical distribution of these executions was incredibly uneven. England, for all its fame with figures like Matthew Hopkins, had a relatively low number of executions, perhaps around 500 in total. Spain and Italy, home to the infamous Inquisitors, also had surprisingly few executions for witchcraft, as their focus was more on heresy among Christians, Jews, and Muslims. The absolute epicenter of the hunts, the bloody heartland of the frenzy, was the Holy Roman Empire, the fragmented, politically complex collection of states that we now know as Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and parts of France and the Netherlands. This region alone may account for almost half of all the executions in Europe. The lack of strong central authority, the intense religious rivalries, and the reliance on Roman law, which heavily sanctioned the use of torture, created a perfect storm for witch hunting to flourish on an industrial scale. But the numbers on their own don't tell the whole story. For every one of the 50 Tsar executed, How many more were arrested, imprisoned, and tortured, only to die in jail or be released as broken, penniless outcasts? How many more had their lives ruined by accusation, their families torn apart, their reputations destroyed? The total number of victims, those whose lives were directly and catastrophically impacted by the hunts, is impossible to calculate, but it is certainly many times the number of the dead. And who were they? These tens of thousands of victims, as we've seen, the overwhelming majority, around 75–80%, were women. But they weren't all the stereotypical old, true, widowed crones of folklore. While elderly women were a highly vulnerable group, the accused came from all walks of life. They were young women like Elspeth, married women like Martha, midwives, healers, merchants' wives, and peasant farmers. No one was truly safe. But the accusation of witchcraft was a weapon that was most easily and effectively wielded against women who were, in one way or another, living on the margins of patriarchal society. One of the most tragic and forgotten groups of victims were the children, not just the child witnesses, but children who were themselves accused of witchcraft. In some of the great panics, like the one in Wurzburg, a significant number of those executed were children, some as young as 7 or 8 years old. They were tortured and made to confess to attending Sabbaths and having demonic familiars. It's a depth of cruelty that the mind struggles to comprehend. The great historical debate here is one of memory and legacy. How do we properly remember these victims for centuries? They were either forgotten or remembered as the guilty figures the trials made them out to be. Only in recent decades has there been a concerted effort to reclaim their stories, to see them not as witches, but as the victims of a complex and brutal form of social, religious, and gendered persecution. Memorials have been erected in places like Salem, and in various towns across Germany and Scotland, formally apologizing for the horrors of the past and listing the names of the dead. As we stand in the silence of this historical graveyard, the sheer scale of the tragedy is overwhelming. Each of the 50 Zaro deaths was a universe of pain and loss. Each one was a failure of reason, a failure of justice, and a failure of basic human empathy. They are the forgotten faces of a dark chapter in history, a chapter that was opened by fear and closed, far too late, by exhaustion. Their stories are a permanent, haunting reminder of what can happen when a society decides it is more important to find a monster to blame than it is to find the truth. And so, we leave the 17th century behind, stepping out of the smoke and the shadows and back into the soft glow of our own modern world. It's easy to look back on the story of Elspeth and the witch hunts as a bizarre and distant horror, a relic of a superstitious, pre-scientific age. It's comforting to think we would never do that now. We're too enlightened, too rational. But are we? The specific vocabulary has changed. Of course, we no longer speak of demonic pacts or the devil's mark. But the underlying psychological and social mechanisms of a witch hunt, the deep human need for a scapegoat in times of fear and uncertainty, have not gone away. The hunt for witches never truly ends, it just changes its costume. Think about it. A witch hunt, at its core, is the process of identifying a group of people, labeling them as the source of a community's problems, stripping them of their humanity, and persecuting them to achieve a sense of purification and control. It's a pattern that has repeated itself throughout human history, right up to the present day. The witch can be anyone who represents a perceived threat to the established order. It can be a political dissident, a racial or ethnic minority, a person with a different sexual orientation, or an immigrant. The crime is no longer consorting with the devil, but treason, degeneracy, disloyalty, or stealing our jobs. The tools of the hunt have been updated. The Malleus Maleficarum has been replaced by inflammatory politic and viral social media posts. The whispers at the village well have become anonymous comment sections and algorithm-fueled echo chambers. The public shaming in the town square now happens on a global scale, 24 hours a day. The story of Elspeth, condemned for her beauty, has a particularly modern resonance. Her beauty made her an object of envy and suspicion. It made her rather. In our own image-obsessed culture, we see how easily people are judged, celebrated, and then torn down based on their appearance. We see how easily a woman's public image can be used as a weapon against her, how her attractiveness can be used to either dismiss her as vapid or paint her as a manipulator. The idea that a woman's face is public property, to be judged and interpreted by the masses, is not a relic of the 1600s. A key feature of the historical witch hunts was the creation of a closed logical loop, where any defense was seen as proof of guilt. Skepticism was heresy. This pattern is alive and well in many modern political and social conflicts. To even question the dominant narrative of one's own tribe is to be branded a traitor. Nuance is seen as weakness, and disagreement is seen as an attack. We retreat into our ideological bubbles, where our own inquisitors feed us a steady diet of confirmation bias, and any dissenting voice is shouted down as a witch. The historical debate here is a contemporary and urgent one. Are these modern phenomena truly equivalent to the historical witch hunts? Some historians are cautious, rightly pointing out that the original hunts were a unique event, backed by the full force of the state and church, and rooted in a specific theological worldview that almost everyone shared. A Twitter mob, however vicious, cannot usually have you legally tortured and executed. However, other scholars and social commentators argue that while the consequences may be different, the underlying psychological patterns are identical. The impulse to fight a simple, personal cause for complex societal problems, the use of fear and rumor to build a consensus of hate, the dehumanization of the target to justify cruelty, the sense of righteous catharsis in a public shaming, these are timeless human failings. The story of the European witch hunts is not just a history lesson. It's a mirror. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about ourselves. Who are our modern day witches? What are the anxieties and fears in our own society that make us look for someone to blame when we participate in online shaming, or share a rumor without checking the facts, or dehumanize those with whom we disagree? Are we not, in our own small way, gathering stones for a modern stoning? The tragedy of Elspeth wasn't that a witch was burned. It was that a woman was turned into a witch in the minds of her neighbors, so that they could burn her with a clear conscience. It serves as a permanent, chilling warning that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones we imagine hiding in the shadows, but the ones that reside within our own hearts, waiting for the right mixture of fear and certainty to be unleashed. The hunt is a dormant virus in the body of every society, and all it needs to reawaken is for good people to become convinced that they know, with absolute certainty, who the witches are. And so, the story comes to a close. The embers of the pyre have long grown cold, and the echoes of the accusations have faded into the deep quiet of the past. The journey we took was a dark one, down a path of fear and suspicion, but we've walked back out into the gentle light of the present. Let the details of the story begin to soften now, like shapes seen through a thick fog. The sharp edges of the fear, the cold dread of the cell, the heat of the flames, let them all recede. They are just shadows now, phantoms in a tale that has been told. You are safe in your bed, in your own time, far from that troubled world. Feel the weight of your own body, the gentle rise and fall of your own breath. You are here, you are now. The past is a distant country, and you have returned from your travels. The voices of the inquisitor and the accusers are fading, replaced by the soft, steady hum of the world around you. Let that sound be your anchor to this peaceful moment. Imagine the story as an old, heavy book. We have read its final page. Now, gently, we close the cover. The sound of soft thud in the quiet room. The story is contained. The darkness is bound within its pages. You can let it go. Your mind can be still. The journey is over. And now, it is time for rest. Let the current of sleep pull you gently away from the shore of wakefulness, out into the calm, deep ocean of your dreams. There are no shadows there, only peace. The end of the article. Good night.